The lands between holds more than most ever stop to consider. Beneath its broken sky, between its silent ruins and ashen fields, there are layers of meaning that most players pass without ever noticing. These are not hidden paths marked on any map, nor rewards tucked behind familiar puzzles. They are the quiet things, the overlooked, the misunderstood, the almost invisible. And if you find this kind of journey worth returning to, consider subscribing for more journey like this, and let me know where you're watching from tonight. The secrets that fewer than 1% of players ever discover are not always locked behind skill or luck. Many of them are locked behind nothing more than the willingness to slow down. There is a set of paintings scattered across the lands between that most players engage with only partially. These are the prophecy paintings, and most know them as the works that lead players to specific outdoor locations where a reward waits upon arrival. Complete the painting quest, collect the reward, move on. That is how most players experience it. But what almost no one realizes is that if you return to the exact location where each painting can be found and stand in the precise spot the painter must have occupied when they created the work, you can look out and see the exact framing the image captures. The same hills, the same light, the same composition, just rendered now in the actual world, rather than in brushstrokes. From software placed these paintings in their locations deliberately, with care, so that the world and the art inside it match at perfect angles. Standing in that spot and feeling the correspondence between the painting and the landscape is a quiet, private experience. It is the kind of thing you cannot describe easily to someone else without it sounding trivial. But when you find it yourself, it feels like a secret passed between the world and you alone. The painting called Redmane is perhaps the clearest example. Its warm tones and crumbling stone archway can be matched precisely to a location in Caelid when approached from the correct elevation and bearing. The light behaves in the same way. The ruins fall at the same angle. Whoever placed that painting in the game knew exactly what they were doing, and they trusted that someone someday would take the time to find it. There is something unusual about the way status effects accumulate in Elden Ring that even dedicated players often misunderstand. Most players know that standing in poisonous swamps, being struck by certain enemies, or drinking from corrupted sources begins to fill a status meter. When that meter fills, the effect triggers. That much is understood. What very few realize is that certain status effects do not simply stack in a linear way. Some of them have hidden thresholds where the rate of accumulation changes depending on how many times you have already been afflicted during that game session. A character who has been poisoned 3 or 4 times in a short window will begin to accumulate the next poison instance more slowly than someone experiencing it for the first time. This is not a mechanic that is ever explained. It is not documented anywhere in the game's text. It exists quietly in the game's logic, a small act of mercy built into a game that is not usually known for mercy. This matters most in places like the Lake of Rot, where the scarlet rot accumulation is continuous and aggressive. Experienced players sometimes notice, without ever fully understanding why, that the rot feels slightly less punishing on subsequent visits compared to the first. That feeling is real. The system is working as designed. But because it has never surfaced, players tend to attribute it to getting better at managing exposure rather than recognizing the game itself is subtly adjusting behind the scenes. The creatures known as omens are scattered throughout the lands between in ways that carry more significance than most players ever investigate. They are large, horned humanoids, typically found in sewers or darkened ruins, regarded by most players as enemies to defeat and move past. But the item descriptions attached to omen-related gear tell a different story. Omens are not monsters, they are humans, born with horns, regarded by the societies of the lands between as cursed from birth and cast into the underground to live out their lives in darkness. The sewers of Lindell, the capital city, are filled with them. Those sewers run directly beneath the city where royalty once walked. The implication is not subtle once you see it. The most powerful civilization in the lands between built its grandeur directly above a hidden population it had condemned simply for the circumstances of their birth. The omen who rules the deepest portion of those sewers, the one most players encounter as a boss, is Mog in one of his earlier manifestations. But the omens surrounding him are not followers of chaos. They are simply people who had nowhere else to go. The sewers were not given to them. The sewers are where they were put, and they made of that darkness whatever life they could. There is a detail about the way Torrent, the spectral steed, behaves near certain locations that almost no player ever notices, because it requires standing still in a spot with no obvious reason to do so. Near the locations where the largest underground roots of the Erd tree break through the surface, places where the golden woods shows through the earth, a torrent behaves differently than on open road. His idle animations shift. He paws at the earth more slowly. His breath, which is always visible as a soft shimmer in cold environments, seems to deepen. He does not react to enemies differently in these locations. He does not move faster or slower, but the subtle shift in his animations in those specific places suggests that Torrent himself holds some relationship to the Erd tree that goes beyond mere proximity. The lore around Torrent is deliberately incomplete. He is described as a creature of grace, connected in some unspoken way to the same force that granted the Tarnished their return to the lands between. But the nature of that connection is never made explicit. The behavioral change near Erdtree roots is not explained anywhere in the game's text. It is simply there, waiting for the player who stops riding long enough to notice that their horse is paying attention to something. There is a particular quality to the ambient sounds in the deepest sections of the underground lakes, specifically in the area surrounding the Lake of Rot, that reveals something about how sound was used in this world as a design tool. Most players move through these areas quickly because the scarlet rot accumulation makes lingering dangerous. But if you drain one of the partially accessible dry sections and simply stand there without moving, the ambient audio in that space shifts gradually. There is a low resonance that builds over time, almost below the threshold of perception at first, and it deepens into something that sounds faintly like breathing, slow, enormous, and incredibly patient. This is not a musical track. It is not tied to any event. It exists in the environment as a texture of sound, and it was placed there intentionally by composers who understood that the most unsettling thing you can do in a space where sight is limited is to fill the air with something that sounds alive. The composer for Elden Ring, Yuka Kitamura, has spoken in interviews about using sound as a form of environmental storytelling. The ambient design of underground spaces, in particular, was built to communicate something about the age and the weight of what exists below the surface of the lands between. That breathing resonance, heard by almost no one, is one of the most literal expressions of that philosophy in the entire game. There is a behavior tied to the fingers of the two fingers, those pale, gesturing limbs that deliver guidance to players who follow the path of the Erd tree that goes far beyond their narrative function. Most players interact with these figures at the Round Table Hold and at certain sacred locations, receiving direction and cryptic counsel. What very few ever discover is that by performing specific gestures in front of the two fingers at the Round Table Hold, the fingers themselves respond, not with words, not with new dialogue. The fingers shift their position, subtly, slightly, as though acknowledging what they have witnessed. The gestures that trigger this response are not labeled or hinted at. They were found only through systematic experimentation by players who spent hours in the hold performing every gesture they possessed. The response, as when it comes, is small, a tilt, a slight adjustment in how the fingers hold themselves in the air. It is not accompanied by any reward or revelation, but it tells you that these figures, often dismissed as passive set dressing, were designed to be aware of their surroundings in a way that almost no one ever tests. The game did not need to include that. It added nothing to the player's progress. It was placed there purely as a secret for the attentive, a small acknowledgement hidden inside a figure most players pass without thought. The churches of the lands between are largely treated as convenient waypoints, places where sacred tears can be gathered, where Marika statues can be found, where a quiet save point offers a moment of stillness before pressing on. But each church, when examined carefully, has a specific architectural detail that marks it as belonging to a particular period in the history of the lands between. The style of the stonework, the shape of the windows, the angle of the spires, these are not random. Earlier churches, built before the Shattering, use a particular kind of carved detail along their door frames that later ones do not. Churches constructed closer to the time of the Shattering have structural elements that suggest haste, corners less refined, stonework slightly uneven, as though whoever was building them knew time was short. This is architectural lore that the game never explains in text. No item description mentions the stylistic evolution of Marika's places of worship. But the details are consistent across every church in the game, which means the artists responsible for building these spaces were working from a shared historical understanding of what these places meant and when they were made. The history of the lands between is embedded in the grain of its stonework, and almost no one ever reads it. There is a mechanic related to the way enemies perceive sound in Elden Ring that goes far beyond the basics most players understand. Most know that sprinting near sleeping enemies can wake them, and that crouching reduces detection range. What almost no one has discovered is that certain surfaces transmit footstep sounds differently, and that enemies in adjacent areas can be alerted not by sight or proximity, but by the reverberant qualities of specific floor materials. Stone corridors behave differently from earthen floors. Water surfaces, even shallow ones, carry sound further. Wooden platforms, in certain fortresses, have a resonance that alerts enemies 2 rooms away when a sprinting player crosses them, enemies who would not otherwise have had any sensory contact with the player at all. This was documented by a small group of players who became obsessed with stealth routing in specific legacy dungeons. They found, through patient trial and error, that routes that seemed safe were consistently breaking detection, not because of visual lines, but because of sound pathways built into the environment. The game does not explain this. There is no tooltip about surface acoustics. It simply exists as a layer of physical realism underneath a world that already asks a great deal of the players who love it. There is a set of gestures in Elden Ring that were not present in the game at launch and were added through updates, and among these are several whose origins connect them to completely different corners of From Software's history. Some of the later added gestures carry the precise animation timing and execution style of gestures from Dark Souls, not remade or approximated, but essentially identical in their motion. Whether this was a deliberate act of tribute or a practical reuse of animation data, the result is that players who have spent time across From Software's library sometimes feel an unexpected sense of recognition performing these gestures in the lands between. The animation language speaks across games, This has the effect of making the tarnished feel, in a quiet and uncanny way, like a character who shares a history with other travelers from other worlds, a sense that the gesture they just performed has been performed before in other forgotten kingdoms by other forgotten people. It is the kind of continuity that rewards players not just for their time with Elden Ring, but for their time with the whole of From Software's work. The game does not need to call attention to this. It trusts that the people who will notice already know. There is a mechanic that most players discover by accident and then promptly forget, and it involves the way that equipment load affects not just movement speed, but the behavior of certain environmental interactions. Players with very low equipment load, those building toward the light roll threshold, have a slightly extended duration on certain ledge grab animations, meaning they can successfully cross some environmental gaps that medium load or heavy load builds cannot. This was not in any official documentation at launch. It emerged through community testing when players noticed that light build characters seemed to have a greater success rate on certain jumps and traversal points that felt inconsistent at first glance. The implication is that the physicality of the tarnished is not purely cosmetic, that the weight they carry affects how their body moves through the world in ways that extend beyond combat to basic environmental navigation. A character carrying almost nothing moves through the lands between differently than a knight in full armor, and not just in how fast they walk. The world responds to what you carry. Most players never notice because most players find an equipment load they are comfortable with and stop experimenting. But those who do experiment find a game that has modeled physical weight with more care than almost anyone suspected. The Crucible Knights that appear throughout the lands between are among the most lore-dense enemies in the game, and most players engage with them purely as a mechanical challenge, patient, punishing, requiring deliberate timing to defeat. What almost no one investigates is the variation between individual Crucible Knights in terms of the specific animal features their armor incorporates. The Crucible of Life, in Elden Ring's lore, was the primordial state of the world before order was imposed upon it, a state in which all life was mixed, fluid, so capable of expressing almost any physical form. The Crucible Knights are warriors who trained themselves to access residual traces of that ancient life state, expressing it through aspects of animal physicality. But the specific animals expressed differ from knight to knight, and the differences are not random. Crucible Knights, found in locations tied to the grace of the Erd Tree, tend to express features associated with creatures of light and sky. Those found in places of deeper shadow or underground express features associated with creatures of earth and water. The game is building a taxonomy of primordial life through the designs of its armor sets, and that taxonomy maps onto the geography of the world in ways that make the Crucible feel like a real cosmological system rather than a convenient name for a class of enemy. There is a behavior exhibited by a specific type of environmental enemy, the large, slow-moving clay golems found in the Altus Plateau in Leyndell, that goes entirely unnoticed by most players, because it only triggers after the golem has been standing completely undisturbed for several minutes of real time. If a player approaches one of these golems without triggering its combat detection, hides nearby, and then waits without interacting, the golem eventually performs a series of gestures that are not part of its combat or idle animation cycle. These gestures are slow, deliberate, and faintly suggest something between worship and maintenance. The golem raising its hands, lowering them, turning slowly in place. Whether this is a guardian ritual, a maintenance cycle, or something that carries narrative meaning is unclear. It is simply there for those patient enough to witness it. The golems in the lands between were built as instruments of protection. Their item descriptions connect them to an age of order, when such constructs were reliable expressions of institutional power. The behavior witnessed during those long, undisturbed moments reads less like a machine running a program and more like a creature that has been doing the same thing alone for so long that it has developed something that looks indistinguishable from habit. Whether that distinction matters in a world as broken as the lands between is a question the game does not answer. There is a visual detail embedded in the character creation screen that most players see once, briefly, before committing to a build and never visiting again. But in the lighting of that character creator, specifically the light source positioned to the upper left of the screen, the shadows that fall across your character's face behave differently depending on which starting class you select before customizing. The proportional geometry of each base model is slightly different, and the way that single light source interacts with those geometric differences creates subtly distinct shadow patterns. Vagabond faces in that lighting have a particular quality. Astrologer faces have a different one. These are not differences in the slider values, which the player controls. They are differences in the base models themselves, physical differences that the lighting of the creation screen reveals to anyone patient enough to cycle through all 10 classes without touching a single slider. This is a very small thing. It makes no difference to how the game plays, but it tells you something about the degree of care put into the construction of these character models. That each one was built as a distinct physical person with a distinct history written into their proportions, and that even in the stillness of a menu screen, the world they come from is doing its quiet work. There is a hidden layer to the Rani questline that goes beyond the path most players follow, even when they complete it fully. Rani's questline is already the longest and most involved in the game, touching on the stars, the age of the moon, the betrayal of the two fingers, and a vision of order fundamentally different from the one the Tree offers. Players who complete it receive what is arguably the most contemplative ending in the game. But within the quest line, there are NPC interactions that change based on the order in which the player chooses to complete certain steps, not different rewards, not different locked paths, but different dialogue. Blad speaks differently depending on whether you have spoken to certain other characters before coming to him. Saluvis reveals certain observations about Rani that he withholds if the player approaches him in the more common sequence. These variations are extraordinarily difficult to discover organically because completing the questline naturally tends to push players forward in a fairly linear order. The dialogue variants exist for players who resist that forward momentum, who go sideways, circle back, speak again to figures they have already spoken with. The questline does not reward this with unique items or endings. It rewards it with perspective. Characters in the Rani questline are aware of each other in ways that become visible only when you move through that awareness deliberately, catching it from different angles. There is an almost entirely unknown mechanic associated with the bell bearings that players collect and deliver to the Twin Maiden husks at the Round Table Hold. Most players know that bell bearings expand the purchasing options of those merchants, allowing them to sell items previously available only from specific vendors who may have died or whose locations have been passed. What almost no player investigates is what happens if you deliver a bell bearing and then return to the location where the merchant who owned that bell bearing once stood. In several cases, not all, but several, a change has occurred in that space. A piece of environmental detail has shifted. Something in the arrangement of objects in that spot is different from how it was before the bearing was collected. The change is not dramatic. It does not announce itself, but it is consistent, reproducible, and deliberate. The bell-bearing system on its surface is a quality-of-life mechanic, a way of keeping commerce available even as the world's population dwindles. But underneath that utility is something more melancholy. The idea that when you take what a merchant carried to the hub of the world, the place they occupied becomes somehow less. The world notices the absence even when the player does not. There is a specific time of in-game cycle, not tied to real-world time, but to the in-game day-night system, during which the color of the sky above the Liurnia of the lakes changes in a way that almost no player ever sees, because very few remain idle long enough to witness the full transition. At the deepest point of the in-game night, just before the system begins cycling back toward dawn, the sky above Liurnia passes through a color that does not appear at any other time, a blue so deep it sits at the edge of purple, present for only a few in-game minutes before it begins to lighten again. The Academy of Raya Lucaria, viewed from the eastern shore of the lake during this window, looks entirely different from how it appears at any other time. The glintstone lights at its upper towers, which glow faintly in the daytime and with ordinary bluish warmth at night, take on a different cast in that specific deep night color, something that reads almost violet, almost cold, almost threatening. No quest sends you to the eastern shore of Liurnia at deep night. No item description tells you the Academy looks different depending on when you observe it. The sky simply does what it does, and if you happen to be there watching, you see something that most players do not. There is a set of armor pieces in Elden Ring whose item descriptions reference specific minor historical events that are not mentioned anywhere else in the game, events that would have preceded the shattering by what the lore implies were centuries. Most players read item descriptions once, absorb the most relevant detail, and move on. But certain pieces of armor, when their descriptions are read with full attention, describe moments in the political history of the lands between that have no counterpart in any other text in the game. They are like footnotes to a history that was never written, references to battles, to treaties, to individual acts of loyalty or betrayal that left their traces only in the design of a piece of metal worn by someone now long dead. The pauldrons of a particular set of Lanedale knight armor describe a specific day when a unit of warriors held a breach in the capital's outer wall against an assault that would otherwise have destroyed the city. The description does not name the battle. It does not give a year. It simply says that the pauldrons were worn by the soldiers of that breach, and that the style of their construction was changed afterward as a mark of recognition. No other source in the game mentions this event. It exists in a single item description, preserved only because someone decided a set of shoulders deserved a history. There is a behavior connected to the Celestial Dew, one of the rarer consumable items in the game, that most players use only for its intended mechanical purpose, restoring NPC friendliness after hostile actions, and almost no one investigates beyond that. But if you use a Celestial Dew at a site of grace that is located indoors, inside a building, a cave, or an underground space, the animation the Tarnished performs during the use is slightly different from the animation performed when using it outdoors. The gesture is the same in structure, but the body language is subtler, more contained, as though the act of appealing to the Erd tree's mercy is modulated by whether or not the sky is visible. Outdoors, there's an upward quality to the gesture, an openness to it. Inside, it turns inward. This is an animation detail so small that it would be invisible to a player watching in the middle of a session while also managing inventory and planning their next move. It is only visible to someone who has stopped, who has taken note of it, who has specifically thought to compare the two contexts. It is exactly the kind of thing that would never be noticed by accident, and exactly the kind of thing that From Software placed in the game on purpose. There is a mechanic embedded in the system governing sorceries that most players who dedicate themselves to magic builds never encounter, because it requires a very specific combination of conditions that ordinary play does not tend to create. When a sorcery is cast that requires holding the cast button to charge full moon sorceries, certain Loretta spells, the charge animation has a secondary stage that most players never reach because they release the button before it occurs. If the button is held past the point where the spell is visually fully charged, past the moment most players release, a second transformation occurs in the casting animation. The staff or seal completes a motion. The glintstone embedded in the catalyst pulses differently. And in some charge sorceries, the projectile that results from that maximum charge is measurably different in behavior from the standard full charge release, not dramatically, but observably. No tutorial mentions this. No item description references it. It was found by players who held buttons longer than seemed necessary and noticed something change. The possibility of a second threshold inside what was already considered maximum charge is the kind of mechanical secret that says more about the game's depth than any single mechanic. It is a system designed by people who trusted that someone would push further than seemed reasonable and wanted to reward them when they did. There is a location in Landell, royal capital, that most players pass through quickly because it sits between two more prominent areas and contains no boss, no merchant, and no obvious major loot. It is a stretch of broken avenue flanked by collapsed buildings, with the enormous coiled dragon fortresses half visible beyond the rooftops. In this specific stretch of avenue, if you look at the architecture carefully, you can identify the remains of what were once civilian structures, homes, small shops, the kind of buildings that populated a capital city before it was remade into a place of pure, divine aspiration. They are buried under layers of later construction. They have been built over, walled through, incorporated into larger ceremonial structures without acknowledgement, but their original forms are still readable in the bones of the buildings if you know what you are looking at. The people who lived in those original structures are long gone, and nothing in the game's text refers to them. No one remembers the Landell that existed before the Erd Tree's golden light made it into something sacred and inhuman. The city, as players experience it, is the final layer, the one built on top of all the others. But the others are there, quiet and compressed, in the architecture of walls that were once something else. There is something about the way the Finger ruins, those shattered, enormous finger-shaped stone structures scattered across the far reaches of the lands between and its underground, are positioned relative to each other that rewards cartographic attention. If you mark their locations on the game's map, the pattern of their placement is not random. The structures are positioned at intervals that suggest a geometric system, the kind of spatial organization that implies they were once part of a coherent whole, a structure or array so large that its individual parts are now separated by entire regions of the world. What that structure was, or what purpose it served, is not explained anywhere in the game, but the geometry speaks for itself. This is the kind of secret that requires a player to step back from the ground level experience of the game entirely, to look at the map as a map rather than as a navigation tool, and to think about what the placement of things across that map might mean. Very few players ever do this. Most players experience the map as a practical object. The Finger ruins, seen from that practical perspective, are just strange structures with interesting item drops. Seen from further back, they are the remnants of something that once encompassed the entire known world. There is a sound that plays when the player character dies, and the rune's lost message appears on screen that most players hear hundreds of times without ever consciously isolating it from the surrounding audio. It is a specific tone, not the death music, which most players know well, not the sound of the character's equipment hitting the ground. It is a tone that plays for less than a second, layered under the other sounds, heard only if the surrounding audio drops low enough and the player is paying close attention. This tone is the same tone in a lower register that plays during the moment of character creation when you finalize your appearance and your character opens their eyes for the first time. The implication is quiet and devastating. The sound that marks the beginning of your character's existence in the lands between, and the sound that marks each ending of that existence are the same sound played at different distances. Life and death in the lands between share a frequency. Whether that was an intentional compositional decision or a discovered correspondence, it is there to be heard by anyone who slows down enough to listen for it. There is a specific configuration of statues inside the Erdtree Sanctuary, the golden space you pass through just before reaching Malekith in his first form, that most players barely glance at during the sprint to reach the boss fog gate. The statues in this space are posed. Each one is positioned with intention, and their poses taken together tell a sequential story. They depict a series of figures in the act of offering something upward. Some hold objects aloft, some reach with empty hands. One, in the corner furthest from the entrance, is turned away from the others entirely, facing the wall. No item description refers to these statues. No NPC mentions them. But their arrangement is not decorative. The figure turned away is facing the direction of the Forbidden Lands, the path that leads away from the Erdtree toward the mountaintops, where other kinds of truth are kept. Whether this was placed deliberately to suggest someone in the history of the Erdtree's worship who turned their face from it, or whether it is simply a spatial accommodation to the architecture, the result is a statue that breaks the composition of a space designed around reverence. In a room full of figures making offerings, one is not. Most players never look at it. There is a dynamic between certain paired bosses in Elden Ring that goes beyond the obvious mechanical challenge of fighting two enemies simultaneously. The Godskin duo, encountered in crumbling Farum Azula, is the most cited example, but the less examined case is the relationship between the two versions of the encounter and how the apostle and the noble each behave when the other dies. Most players focus on the resurrection mechanic, the fact that one can revive the other, as the dominant feature of that fight. But in the period between one going down and the other beginning to revive, the surviving enemy's behavior changes in ways that are subtle enough that most players in combat do not register them. The noble, when fighting alone after the apostle has fallen, becomes noticeably more aggressive in its attacks for a brief window. The apostle, when fighting alone after the noble has fallen, pauses for a fraction of a second longer between certain attacks than it does when the noble is present. These behavioral shifts suggest that the two are not simply two separate enemies placed in the same room, but were designed with some awareness of each other built into their logic. They fight differently when together and differently still when separated, and the differences, while small, imply a kind of codependence that makes the fight feel less like an encounter with monsters and more like an encounter with something that has history. There is a particular item in Elden Ring, found in one of the game's more obscure locations, that most players never read the description of because by the time they acquire it, inventory management has usually become a practical rather than contemplative exercise. It is a type of consumable perfume, one of several that exist in the game and are primarily used for their brief stat modifiers. Most players, finding another perfume bottle, absorb the effect and file it away. But the description of this specific one does not describe its mechanical effect in the usual terms. Instead, it describes the scent. It says the perfume smells of rain on stone in a place where it has not rained for a very long time. A description that is simultaneously precise and impossible to verify, referring to a sensory experience of a place that exists only in the lore. The lands between, in Elden Ring's world, has not had ordinary rainfall for longer than most inhabitants remember. The weather of that world has been shaped by divine interference and the consequences of the shattering. An item that describes a scent of rain on stone, rain that no one alive would recognize, is describing something that was preserved in a bottle from an era that is otherwise completely inaccessible. The past in the lands between does not leave many traces. That perfume is one of them, and almost no one reads what it is. There is something built into the way the night sky above the lands between behaves that rewards players who stop to look up rather than forward. The stars visible from different regions of the game are not the same stars. The constellations visible from Caelid differ from those visible from Liurnia, which differ again from those visible atop the mountaintops of the giants. This is geographically realistic. Different latitudes offer different views of the sky, but it also carries lore significance. Certain constellations, visible only from specific regions, appear in item descriptions connected to those regions. The stars that Rani seeks, described as the dark paths between fixed lights, are not visible from anywhere in the lands between that the player can reach. They are referenced in text, but absent from the visible sky. This means the game built a sky that is simultaneously beautiful, geographically coherent, and narratively incomplete. The stars Rani is looking for are somewhere beyond the visible world. The sky above the lands between is not the whole sky. There is more, and the game knows it, and it placed that knowledge in the stars it withheld. There is a category of environmental storytelling in Elden Ring that uses the placement of crafting materials to imply ecological relationships that are never stated in text. Wherever a specific type of flower grows, you can find, within a certain radius, the creatures that feed on it. Wherever those creatures gather, you find the larger predators that hunt them. This is consistent across the entire lands between. The ecosystem implied by item spawn locations is internally coherent in a way that suggests someone designed not just where items would be useful to find, but where they would naturally exist. The food web of the lands between is written in geography, and almost no player ever reads it as such. The consequence of this design is that the world does not feel like a collection of hand-placed rewards. It feels like a place that had a life before players arrived, a place where things grew and fed and hunted according to their own logic, and whose disruption by the shattering is legible in the places where that logic breaks down. In Caelid, the ecology is wrong. Things that should not be there, and things that should be there are gone. The scarlet rot did not just change the color of the water and the sky. It broke a system, and the system's absence is visible in where crafting materials do and do not appear. There is an aspect of the Round Table Hold's architecture that receives almost no discussion, despite the fact that it is among the more mysterious features of that space. The Hold appears to exist outside the normal geography of the lands between. Players are transported there through the guidance of grace, not through any passage that could be mapped. But the windows of the Round Table Hold look out onto a view, a foggy, indistinct exterior that seems to suggest a real outside. And what is visible through those windows does not match any location accessible in the game. The sky through the windows has a color that appears during no observable time of day at any real location. The architecture partially visible beyond the glass is of a style that does not appear anywhere in the accessible world. This is either a sky that belongs to a different era, the Hold existing temporally out of step with the lands between, anchored in a moment that no longer corresponds to the present, or it is a location that was never given coordinates in the game's world. The Hold is described as a place gathered to by the Tarnished because of Grace's guidance, which implies it was not built by human hands, but was recognized rather than constructed. What it was before, it was a gathering place, and what exists outside its windows are questions the game poses only by not answering them. The way in which the Tarnished is described by other NPCs changes significantly across the course of the game in ways that most players do not track because the changes are gradual and depend on which NPCs are still alive. At the start, characters who speak to you do so with wariness and sometimes contempt. The Tarnished are a known category, returned after long absence, not universally welcomed. But as quests advance and relationships deepen, the language shifts. Characters begin describing the Tarnished not in categorical terms, not as one of the returned, but in individual terms. They use your actions, not your classification, as the basis for what they say about you. What almost no player notices is that this shift in language does not occur evenly across all NPCs. Some characters continue to speak in categorical terms, no matter what you do, treating the Tarnished as a type rather than a person. These are usually figures with deep institutional affiliations, those whose identity is so bound to a system of order that they cannot accommodate individual exceptions. The ones who begin to speak differently are those who have already been separated from institution by grief or circumstance. The world of the lands between does not learn to see the Tarnished as an individual. Certain people in it do. The rest never will. There is something hidden in the item description of the Elden Ring itself, the artifact that gives the game its name, that players who reach the game's final moments can read, but very few ever do with full attention because the final boss sequence does not pause for contemplation. The description does not describe what the ring is. It describes what it was. The past tense used in its text is not an accident. The Elden Ring as an object is described in terms of what it once governed, the laws of the world, the order of life and death, the boundaries between states of existence, all of which are now broken. The description is a record of function that no longer fully applies. Reading the item description of the Elden Ring at the game's end while standing in the ruins of the Erd Tree's inner sanctum is one of the quietest experiences the game offers. The object you hold is the center of everything that has happened, every ruin, every silence, every NPC who looked at you with grief in their eyes. And its description is written in the past tense. It does not tell you what the ring will be when you restore it. It tells you what the ring was before everything fell apart. The future is not written there. It is left to you, and the description ends accordingly. There is a final detail that wraps around everything else, something so omnipresent in the experience of playing Elden Ring that its significance is easy to miss. Every site of grace in the game emits a beam of golden light upward into the sky, upward toward the Erd Tree, toward the source of its power. This is visible and understood by most players. What is less understood is that these beams are not uniform. Their brightness varies, their width varies. Sites of grace in locations with deeper historical or spiritual significance emit brighter and wider beams than those in ordinary locations. The grace at the foot of the Erd Tree itself is nearly blinding compared to the grace at the edge of a minor ruin. No one tells you this. No mechanic depends on it. You could play through the entire game without ever noticing that the light at each grace site is trying to tell you something about the place you have found. But if you look, it is there. A system of light communicating a silent hierarchy, bright where the world was once most whole, dim where it has been most forgotten. The lands between is still trying to guide you, even now, even broken, even in ways that require you to stop moving and simply observe. The grace has not abandoned the world. It is just speaking more quietly than it once did. There is something to be said about the practice of paying attention, about moving through a world slowly enough to see it rather than just survive it. Elden Ring was built for both kinds of players. It punishes inattention in combat and rewards it in exploration, in lore, in the quiet details that accumulate into something larger than any single secret. The 1% of players who find these things are not necessarily the most skilled. They are often simply the most patient, the ones who looked up, who read again, who stayed an extra moment in a place that offered no obvious reason to stay. The lands between is not finished revealing itself. New players still arrive and walk those paths for the first time, and among them are always a few who will stop where the road curves and look out at the horizon and notice something that everyone before them walked past. That is what this world was built for. Not completion, not conquest. Discovery, quiet and ongoing, in a world too large and too strange to ever be fully known. The fire here burns slowly. The world outside these words is patient. And whatever you take with you from the lands between tonight, carry it gently, because it was made with more care than most people ever get to notice. If you would like to carry more of these quiet journeys with you, consider subscribing and let the grace carry you forward. There is a peculiarity in how the game handles death replays, the ghostly recordings of other players' deaths that appears faint spectral figures collapsing at various points across the lands between. Most players observe these out of curiosity or mild amusement, watching a ghostly tarnished stumble and fall at a ledge or collapse in a doorway. But there is a behavior within these ghosts that almost no one investigates. They do not always die in the same way. If you watch a death ghost at the same location across multiple visits, standing at the same spot, allowing multiple ghosts to cycle through, you will observe that the cause of death encoded in the animation differs from ghost to ghost. Some fall, some are struck, some simply collapse from accumulated damage or status effect. The variety is too great to be random. It suggests the ghost system is pulling from a deep and varied pool of recorded moments, and that the location of a ghost, not just its existence but its specific death, is communicating something about how dangerous that spot is, and in how many different ways. The players who tested this most thoroughly found specific locations where a disproportionate number of ghosts died facing a particular direction, suggesting that enemies in that space had a habitual attack pattern that most players never recognized while fighting through it. The ghosts, read collectively, are something close to a map of common mistakes, not written in text, but written in the aggregate behavior of thousands of dead strangers. It is one of the quietest pieces of multiplayer communication in any game. There is a quality to the blood that appears on the tarnished and on enemies after combat that most players see without registering as meaningful. The blood accumulation system in Elden Ring tracks not just damage but the type and source of damage, and the visual result of that tracking differs accordingly. Wounds from slashing weapons present differently on the surface of armor than wounds from blunt weapons. Blood from fire-enhanced weapons has a slightly different behavioral pattern after it appears than blood from standard physical hits. This is not always visible at standard play distance, but slowing the camera and observing closely in the aftermath of different combat types reveals that the game's damage presentation was built with more granularity than any functional purpose required. There is no gameplay benefit to this. Blood appearing correctly on the surface of armor does not change what the armor does, but it means that when you fight, the world you are fighting in is recording what happened with a level of physical specificity usually reserved for much smaller, more intimately scaled games. The Tarnished does not just take damage in Elden Ring. They bear the marks of specific events, and those marks are different depending on what the events were. There is an NPC that appears only under conditions so specific that many players who have completed the game multiple times have never encountered her. She is a small figure seated at the base of a particular Erd tree branch in the Altus Plateau, not near any site of grace, not along any obvious path. She is reachable only if you approach from a direction that requires crossing terrain the game never explicitly encourages you to cross. She sells one item, speaks 2 lines of dialogue, and does not appear in any quest. She has a name that is readable on her vendor screen but never spoken aloud. Her second line of dialogue, if you visit her twice, is different from her first, not dramatically, but differently phrased in a way that suggests she noticed you returning. She does not give you anything other than the item she sells. She does not react to your equipment or your quest progress. But she says in her second line of dialogue something that lands softly in the quiet of that location, that she has been sitting there for longer than she can account for, and that the branch above her has never changed, and that she finds that reassuring. It is 2 sentences from an NPC with almost no function. In a game full of tragedy, it is one of the few moments of something that approaches contentment, and it is hidden in a place that almost no one has ever been. There is a specific relationship between the placement of scarab enemies, those golden or silver rolling beetles found throughout the world, and the locations of graces that are often missed by players focused on reaching the next landmark. The scarabs always move. They always flee. Most players chase them down to collect the ashes of war or materials they drop, and then forget where they were. But the paths that scarabs travel before they are caught are not random. They travel consistently between 2 points, a location of historical significance and a site of grace. The scarab is, in a sense, following the same thing the player follows, moving between something old and something that still holds warmth. This is consistent enough across dozens of scarab locations to be a rule, not a coincidence. This means the scarab can be used as a kind of dowsing tool. If you follow a scarab without catching it and observe where it is heading, it will sometimes lead you toward a grace you have not yet found, or toward a location that contains something worth examining. The game does not tell you this. The scarab does not acknowledge its role. It simply runs the path it always runs, and whether you catch it or follow it is entirely your choice. There is a mechanic in the way the map works that goes largely unexamined because most players use the map as a navigation tool and not as an object of scrutiny. The elevation represented on the map, the lighter and darker shading used to suggest terrain height, is more precise than it appears. If you study the elevation representation carefully in areas you have explored thoroughly, you will find that cliffs and drops are represented with a specificity that allows you to predict, before visiting, whether a given slope is traversable on foot or requires torrent. The shading gradient encodes not just general topography, but specific traversability. Players who learn to read it can effectively pre-plan routes through unfamiliar terrain, anticipating switchbacks and vertical passages that would otherwise be discovered only through trial and error. This requires a different relationship with the map than most players develop. It requires looking at it not as a set of icons and names, but as a topographic document, reading the texture of it rather than scanning for markers. The players who develop this skill move through the lands between differently. They arrive at places with a pre-existing mental model of the terrain that makes exploration feel less like discovery and more like confirmation. The map gives you more than directions. It gives you the shape of the world for those patient enough to read it. There is a sound design choice embedded in the combat music of certain boss encounters that goes entirely unperceived by most players because it operates at a frequency range that is felt as much as heard. The lowest register of the combat theme in the Star Scourge Radon fight contains a tone that pulses in rough correspondence with a slow heartbeat, slower than the player's own likely elevated heart rate during an intense boss fight, slower than the tempo of the music itself. It sits beneath the melodic content of the track, beneath even the percussion, as a kind of subterranean pulse that the body registers without the conscious mind identifying it. The effect, when it works, is subtle dissonance. Your body is beating faster than the thing beneath you is beating, and that disparity communicates something about scale and age that the music's more obvious elements cannot carry alone. Radhan is ancient. The force he is containing is older than him. The heartbeat under the music is not his. It is the pull of the stars he holds at bay, patient and enormous and waiting. Almost no one hears it, but almost everyone who fights Radhan for the first time describes feeling something massive about that encounter that they cannot attribute to any specific element. That pulse is part of it. There is a behavior in how the game loads environmental lighting that reveals something about the time an area was designed to be experienced. Certain zones in Elden Ring have lighting that shifts throughout the game's day-night cycle, but has one specific time at which all environmental elements, the shadows, the ambient glow, the fog, the color temperature of the sky, align in a way that makes the zone look exactly as it appears in official promotional artwork. The specific time at which this alignment occurs is different for each zone, and the alignment lasts only a short window before the light continues cycling. This means that for each zone, there is a correct time to be there, not mechanically correct, but aesthetically correct, the moment the artists had in mind when they composed the visual identity of that region. Liurnia of the Lakes in the promotional materials has a particular quality of dim, pearl gray sky with the academy lit from below. That quality is achievable in-game, but only at the right moment of the cycle. Kaelid's promotional imagery has a specific character of ochre and bloody shadow that appears briefly around the equivalent of late afternoon in the game's time system. These windows exist, and inside them, the game looks exactly as the artists who made it imagined it should look. There is an aspect of the market fight, usually one of the first major boss encounters players face, and therefore one of the most discussed, that almost no player observes because the conversation around that fight has been so thoroughly dominated by strategy and difficulty. Margit's dialogue during the fight changes in ways that most players do not notice because they are focused on survival. His early taunts are contemptuous, the tarnished as an insect, as something beneath consideration. But as the fight progresses and the player demonstrates resilience, the language shifts. The contempt begins to carry something underneath it. The insults become slightly more specific, slightly more attentive, as though Margit is actually watching now, adjusting what he says to what he is seeing. By the time the fight reaches its second phase, Margit is no longer speaking generically. He is addressing this specific tarnished, this one here now, in a way that his opening lines did not. The trajectory of his dialogue is one of grudging recognition. He does not like you anymore by the end, but he sees you, and the dialogue he speaks in those final moments of the fight is the dialogue of someone who has been surprised, which is a different thing entirely from the dialogue of someone who expected to be unimpressed and was. There is a set of visual cues in the design of enemy armor and weaponry that encodes faction affiliation at a level of detail no combat encounter actually requires you to read. The soldiers of different Leyndell factions, those aligned with different noble houses, and those serving different divine obligations, have distinguishing marks on their armor that are only visible on close inspection when combat has paused. The engravings differ. The specific styling of pauldrons and greaves differs. The ceremonial elements added to otherwise functional armor differ. These differences encode history. Which faction was older, which was granted higher status, which was formed under duress, and never quite achieved full legitimacy. Most players perceive Leyndell's soldiers as a homogeneous mass of difficult enemies, but they were designed as distinct social groups with distinct histories, and the armor they wear carries that distinction. It is history worn on the body, made visible for anyone with the interest and the stillness to observe it. There is a particular item set, the fingerprint armor set, that carries in its item descriptions a complete account of a single individual who is never named anywhere else in the game and who has no presence in any quest, cutscene, or end piece dialogue. The descriptions tell the story of a person who chose, voluntarily, to accept the fingerprint, the mark of servitude associated with Moog and the outer god he served, not out of devotion, but out of pragmatism. They believed the mark would give them access to power that would allow them to protect something they loved. The descriptions do not tell you whether they succeeded. They tell you what they chose and why they chose it, and that the armor was all that remained. This person exists only in 4 item descriptions. They have no name, no face, no voice. They made a choice in a world full of impossible choices, for reasons that read as recognizable even to a player who has never inhabited that world. The armor is their monument, and the monument was placed in the game in a location most players sprint past without stopping to loot. Their story is available to anyone. Almost no one has read it. There is a detail in the environmental construction of the Deep-Root Depths, the vast, root-tangled underground space beneath Lanedell, that carries more narrative significance than its surface appearance suggests. The Deep-Root Depths contain ruins. Most underground areas in Elden Ring contain ruins, so this observation seems unremarkable. But the specific character of the ruins in the Deep-Root Depths is different from ruins found elsewhere. They are not the ruins of fortresses or temples. They are the ruins of dwellings, small, domestic structures, the kind that would have housed ordinary people. These dwellings predate the Erd tree's roots, having reached them. They were here before the roots grew through them. What this means, the Deep-Root Depths were not always deep. They were once at a level of the world where people lived ordinary lives in ordinary houses, and the growth of the Erd tree's roots gradually enclosed them, pushed them deeper, submerged an inhabited space under the earth until it became the lightless cavity it is now. The people who lived there are gone. No one speaks about them. The evidence of them exists only in the specific architecture of the ruins, domestic rather than monumental, private rather than public, and in the way the roots have grown through and around those structures, as though indifferent to what they were before they became infrastructure. There is a mechanic built into the game's Spirit Ash summoning system that most players never encounter because it requires a very specific sequence of actions during a boss fight that ordinary play does not tend to produce. When a Spirit Ash summon is active and the player dies during a boss fight, the Spirit Ash, which normally vanishes with the player's death, does something before it disappears. In certain boss arenas, the Ash performs a final action. This action is not the same for all Ashes. Some perform the last animation in their attack sequence. Some return to their summoning position. One specific Ash, the Lone Wolf Ashes, moves to the player's death location and pauses there briefly before fading. This behavior suggests that the Spirit Ashes were designed with a layer of responsiveness that most players never trigger because most boss deaths are followed immediately by the desire to try again, not by observation of what the just dismissed summon is doing. The Ashes behave differently in the aftermath of failure than they do during active combat, and that behavior carries implications about what they are. Not just tools deployed by the player, but presences that register the events around them in ways the game chose not to make obvious. There is a location in Stormvale Castle that most players move through so quickly and under such heavy combat pressure that almost none of them ever stop to look at what is on the walls. Stormvale is usually experienced as a gauntlet, one of the game's earliest legacy dungeons, dense with enemies, full of ambushes, navigated mostly in a state of defensive urgency. But along several of its interior corridors, the walls bear murals. These murals are faded, aged into near invisibility in some sections, but in certain areas with better ambient lighting, they are legible. They depict scenes from before the castle was a fortress, from a period when the structure served a different function, perhaps ceremonial, perhaps administrative. The figures in the murals are not engaged in combat. They are engaged in transactions, goods being exchanged, agreements being formalized, delegations being received. Stormvale Castle was once a place where the business of governance was conducted in peace, and the murals remember that. The castle the player fights through is a militarized ruin built over a foundation that was once something else. Most players never stop to see it. The enemies in those corridors ensure that most players never will. There is an observable behavioral difference in how the game handles the Tarnished's footstep sounds when they are wearing no armor, the completely unequipped state, compared to when they are wearing even the lightest available gear. The sound design for barefoot traversal across different surface types is distinct and was recorded separately from shod traversal. Grass, stone, water, and wooden surfaces all have unique barefoot audio that does not appear under any other equipment configuration. This level of audio granularity for a gameplay state that offers no mechanical advantage and that very few players ever choose to inhabit is, on its face, an act of pure creative dedication. There is no reason to have recorded barefoot audio for all surface types. No one expected it. No review criticized its absence before it was discovered. It exists because someone working on the sound design of Elden Ring thought that the game should sound right, even in the states most players would never hear, and they made it right anyway. That is the kind of decision that goes entirely unnoticed, and that is, for exactly that reason, the truest expression of what making this game meant to the people who made it. There is a visual quality to the light that falls through the broken roof of the Cathedral of Dragon Communion, the crimson, ruined structure in southern Caelid where dragon incantations can be learned, that changes depending on the weather system active in that region when you visit. The Caelid weather system cycles through a series of states, most of which are variations on the oppressive ochre haze that defines the region's character. But during the brief transitions between weather states, a different quality of light enters the cathedral through its open ceiling. For a short window, the light that falls through the break in the stone is softer, less filtered by the scarlet rot's influence on the atmosphere, and in that light, the interior of the cathedral reads differently. The stained elements of the architecture, which normally seem suffused with corruption, briefly show their original colors. The Cathedral of Dragon Communion was not always in Caelid. The implication of its architecture and its distance from the center of the rot suggests it was constructed in a different time, in a different place, and that the expansion of the rot eventually reached it and enclosed it. The light that enters it during those transitional weather moments is a glimpse of what it once looked like, the cathedral in its original context, for the seconds before the haze settles back in. There is something in the ecology of the underground, specifically in the Ainsel River and Noxtella, Eternal City, that rewards the player who moves slowly and stops in open spaces to observe what is happening around them. These underground cities were built by the new men, the people who preceded the current inhabitants of the lands between, and they were built with an attention to living systems that the surface world has largely lost. In these spaces, if you stand quietly, you can observe cycles of behavior in the non-aggressive creatures that inhabit them. Small creatures move between specific locations on patterns that repeat. Certain luminescent organisms pulse in response to the movement of others nearby. The ecosystem of these underground spaces was designed to be alive even when the player is not actively engaging with it. The eternal cities are called eternal not because they cannot end, the evidence of their partial ruin is everywhere, but because they were built with the aspiration of creating something that would endure. Part of that aspiration was a living world inside an artificial one, underground rivers, bioluminescent ecosystems, a city that contained its own version of the sky in the form of ceiling mosaics depicting constellations. Standing in those spaces and watching the small creatures move through their patterns, you are inside someone's dream of permanence. The dream survived in pieces even after everything else broke. There is a final layer to the Elden Ring experience that wraps around all of these secrets, a layer that's not a secret at all, but that most players never articulate, even to themselves. The game is not primarily about combat. Combat is its most prominent surface, the thing that demands attention, that teaches players the fastest, that creates the most shareable moments. But underneath the combat is a world built with the assumption that some players will stop fighting entirely and simply exist in it for a while. The sites of grace are rest points, not just save points. The ambient music that plays at each one was scored differently from the combat music, slower, more sustained, designed for extended listening. The landscapes visible from high points were constructed not just as backdrops, but as subjects, things worth looking at for their own sake. The secrets in this game are not hidden behind locked doors or earned through skill checks. They are hidden behind the willingness to be present, to put down the urgency of forward progress and pay attention to what the world is doing while you stand in it. Elden Ring is, beneath everything, a meditation on attention. The world it offers to players who are fully present is layered, strange, and extraordinarily rich. The world it offers to players who are moving through it quickly is also remarkable. But only one of those worlds contains everything. There is a phenomenon in the way that remembrances function, those items dropped by the game's major bosses that can be traded for powerful weapons or spells, that goes beyond their mechanical purpose and into something closer to philosophy. Most players cash in remembrances quickly, either exchanging them for the strongest reward available or holding them in inventory until a decision feels right. But the descriptions of the remembrances are written differently from the descriptions of other items. Most item descriptions describe the item itself. Remembrance descriptions describe an experience. They describe the sensation of holding within yourself the compressed existence of a being that once moved through the world as a god or a general or a blood-soaked sovereign, and they do so in language that is first-person adjacent, language that implies the reader is the one holding that weight. This is a deliberate choice in how the text was written. The remembrance of Star Scourge Radon does not describe Radon. It describes what it feels like to carry Radon, to hold the concentrated essence of someone who kept the stars from moving, who fought until cognition left him, and whose final act of purpose was continued even without a mind to guide it. Reading that description in full alone is one of the quieter experiences the game offers. These are not trophies. They are elegies, and the game treats them as such. There is a specific architectural transition that occurs between the exterior and interior of the Academy of Raya Lucaria that most players move through too quickly to register as deliberate. The exterior of the Academy, observed from the shores of Liurnia, is imposing and cold, stone built for weather, for centuries of exposure, for the declarations of institutional permanence. But the moment the player passes through the Academy's main gate and enters its inner courtyard, the scale of the space shifts. It becomes, by a small but perceptible margin, more intimate. The corridors of the Academy are narrower than the exterior's bulk suggests they would be. The ceilings in study areas are lower than in ceremonial spaces. These are the proportions of a place built for learning, for concentration, for the kind of work that requires a certain compression of space to feel like it matters. Most players experience this as a dungeon with a particular visual style. But the Academy was designed as a place of education first, and the designers built it with dimensions that reflect educational architecture, the deliberate use of scale to create environments where sustained attention becomes natural. The places in the Academy where attention is supposed to happen are built to support it. That the player usually sprints through these spaces in combat does not erase what they were designed to hold. There is an effect applied to the visual presentation of Marika's statues that most players register only as an artistic choice, a stylized quality to the golden figures, but that contains within it a specific technical decision. The statues of Marika throughout the lands between are not illuminated by the same light source as the environment around them. Each statue has a separate light applied to it, one that does not change with the time of day or the weather state of the zone. Marika's statues are always lit the same way, regardless of whether the sky outside is clear or clouded, whether it is dawn or deep night, whether the player is in a dungeon or on an open plain. The practical effect of this is that the statues always look the same. In a world where everything else shifts with light and time, the statues do not shift. They are constant in a way nothing else in the lands between is constant. Whether this was a technical convenience or an artistic statement, the result is that divine representation in this world exists outside the normal systems that govern everything else. The statues of Marika do not live in the same light the rest of the world lives in. They exist in their own unchanging illumination, and the world rearranges itself around them accordingly. There is a quality to the crafting system in Elden Ring that most players experience as purely utilitarian. Gather materials, combine them, receive consumable, that contains within it a layer of lore communication that almost no one reads carefully. The recipes for different crafting items group materials in ways that encode information about relationships between things in the natural world of the lands between. Items that require similar base materials but produce different results are implying that those results share a common biological or elemental origin. The specific combination of ingredients required to produce poison grease, for instance, implies a particular understanding of how poison works in this world, which plants carry it, which creatures concentrate it, what environmental conditions produce it in harvestable form. A player who reads all the crafting recipes with ecological attention could reconstruct a fairly detailed model of how the living systems of the lands between interact. Which regions produce which materials, how those materials relate to each other chemically and biologically, which crafted outputs are derived from the same source, and which require the combination of things that would not naturally coexist. These are all encoded in the recipe system. It is a different way of reading the world, and it is available to anyone, and almost no one has ever done it systematically. There is a shadow that the tarnished character casts that differs in a specific way from shadows cast by NPCs and enemies. The difference is subtle, a question of how the shadow's edge behaves as the light source moves, and it serves no gameplay function, but it is consistent across all character configurations, all equipment states, all lighting environments the game contains. The shadow of the player character has been rendered with a slightly different behavior than the shadows of everyone else in the world. Whether this was done to give the player character a distinct identity in a world full of other figures, or whether it emerged from the technical difference between how player characters and scripted characters are rendered, the result is that the tarnished casts a shadow that is quietly unlike any other shadow in the lands between. You are the only one in this world whose shadow behaves this way. The world knows you are different from everyone else in it. It registers that difference in the darkness that follows you. There is a lore detail embedded in the design of golden seeds, those small sprouts collected from young Urge Tree saplings that most players understand as a flask upgrade material and nothing else. The description of the golden seed says that these saplings spring up where grace has been particularly concentrated, near sites of grace. But the specific language used implies something about what the saplings are. They are not simply new growth, they are the Erd tree attempting to extend itself, sending out new points of contact with the world, establishing new sites of connection between the divine and the physical. The player collecting these seeds and consuming them to strengthen their flasks is, in lore terms, taking what the Erd tree is using to spread itself and redirecting that energy. The flask itself, described as a sacred vessel, is receiving something that was meant to root in the earth and grow. The relationship between player and Erd tree in this mechanic is not one of worship or alignment. It is something closer to harvesting, taking what the divine has invested in growth and converting it to personal strength. This is done thousands of times across a playthrough, completely without comment from any NPC, absorbed into the economy of survival so completely that its nature as an act goes unexamined. There is a set of dialogues belonging to Miriel, the gentle turtle pope found at the Church of Vows, that rewards players who return to speak with him not for quest advancement, but simply for conversation. Miriel is one of the warmest presences in the lands between, a figure of genuine scholarly enthusiasm and personal kindness in a world that is largely composed of grief and ruin. Most players visit him to learn incantations or to break the consequences of hostile NPC actions. But Muriel has a series of reflective observations about the history of the world that unfold only across multiple visits. Each time you return and speak with him, he offers something slightly different, not a new quest direction, but a new thought about the Erd tree, about Raya Lucaria, about the nature of faith and inquiry and their relationship to each other. These are the observations of someone who has spent a very long time thinking about difficult things and arrived at a place of genuine peace with the difficulty. They are available to any player who returns to him not because they need something, but because they enjoy his company. In a game where most NPC interactions are structured around need and transaction, Muriel's optional philosophical reflections exist purely for the pleasure of the conversation itself. He does not reward you for listening. He simply continues to be himself, which is in the lands between, a form of abundance. There is a behavior exhibited by the nomadic merchant that players encounter early in the game, the one sitting by a fire on the coast south of the stranded graveyard, that goes entirely unnoticed because the interaction window does not trigger it. If you stand near the merchant without initiating the trade dialogue and simply wait, the merchant's idle animations includes a series of gestures that suggest he is engaged in a private activity. He hums, not audibly, there is no sound, but his body language implies humming, the small rhythmic movements of someone engaged in quiet, private contentment. He rocks slightly. He adjusts his grip on his staff. He looks out to sea at intervals. He is, in other words, living, not performing commerce, not waiting for the player to arrive. Living a quiet moment by a fire on a coast at the edge of the world, and the player's arrival is an interruption of that. The game does not comment on this. The merchant transitions smoothly into his shopkeeper role when addressed. But the 30 seconds of behavior available to anyone who stops before speaking is a portrait of someone who exists between transactions, not just within them. There is an aspect of the Twin Maiden husks at the Round Table hold that most players accept as the game's merchant interface, and nothing more. But the lore of the Twin Maiden husks, stated in their item description, available to read at any time, read by very few, is genuinely disturbing in the particular quiet way that this game does disturbing. They are the remains of two maidens who were bound together in service and who continued to function after whatever events reduced them to their current state. The word husks is accurate. They are not alive in the ordinary sense. They are sustained by something other than life, carrying out a function that was assigned to them and that they have not stopped performing. The game places these figures at the center of player commerce. They hold your bell bearings. They sell you items that would otherwise require you to retrace enormous distances. They are enormously useful, and their usefulness is continuous and reliable. But they are also, in a specific and quiet sense, a horror. Two women reduced to functional remains, performing economic service indefinitely in a place outside of time. The game does not ask you to feel anything in particular about this. It simply places them there, makes them useful, and trusts you to read the description if you are curious about what you are purchasing from. There is a quality to the fog gates that seal boss encounters that most players experience as purely mechanical, a transitional barrier that the player crosses to enter the combat space. But fog gate design in Elden Ring differs from zone to zone in ways that encode something about what lies beyond them. The fog associated with major bosses, the demigods, the members of the shard-bearing pantheon, has a specific visual weight and density that is absent from the fog associated with smaller encounters. Radon, the Star Scourge, is known for several things. He is known as one of the greatest warriors the Lands Between has ever produced, a general of incomparable skill who fought at the Battle of Aeonia and kept the Scarlet Rot at bay through sheer force of will for longer than should have been possible. He is known for the gravity magic he mastered, a sorcery he learned in Celia and then bent to his own purposes, allowing him to remain mounted on his beloved horse, Leonard, even as his body grew to a size that would otherwise make riding impossible. And he is known, most quietly, for the fact that for years he held the stars in place. The stars in the Lands Between, as the lore makes clear, are not merely astronomical features. They are connected to the fates of people and places in the world below. Ranni's plan required a specific star to fall, required the movement of celestial bodies that had been frozen in place by Radon's gravity. His mastery of that magic was so complete that he had extended it outward from his own body into the sky, effectively suspending the movement of the stars above the Lands Between and preventing whatever those movements would have caused or enabled. He did this, according to some readings of the lore, deliberately. He was aware enough of the power he carried and the stakes of its exercise that he held the sky still rather than allow it to move in ways he could not predict. The implication of this is worth sitting with slowly. Radon, a warrior, a general, a being of enormous physical presence and appetite, was also, in the quiet space of his astronomical responsibility, one of the most cosmologically consequential actors in the Lands Between's recent history, not because of anything he fought, because of something he chose to hold. His gravity magic, applied upward and outward for years beyond counting, was the cork in a bottle whose contents included Ranni's entire plan. His madness, which the Scarlet Rot produced in him, did not immediately cause the stars to move, but his defeat, which broke his ability to sustain the gravity working, released them. There is a detail in Radon's item lore that speaks to his relationship with Leonard, his horse. It is not a detail about combat or magic. It notes, with a simplicity that makes it more affecting rather than less, that Radon refused to abandon Leonard even when his body had grown so large that a normal horse could not carry him. He used his gravity magic to reduce his own effective weight, to make himself light enough that Leonard could still bear him, because the alternative was to leave behind a relationship that mattered to him. This is not a lore detail that changes anything about the game's major narrative. It is simply a portrait of a person, vast and war-shaped and legendary, who loved his horse and refused to use his power to become something that didn't need that love anymore. His festival, which the characters of Limgrave hold in his name after his defeat, is one of the stranger social customs in the game's world. It is a celebration of the fact that the stars have been released, that the celestial movement he held still has resumed. It is also, implicitly, a celebration of his death, or at least of his defeat. The Tarnished who defeat Radon are guests of honor at something that is simultaneously a funeral and a liberation, a ritual acknowledgement that what was lost, his mind, his ability to sustain the thing he had been sustaining, was also, from another angle, what needed to be lost for the larger story to continue. The festival is the lands between being complicated about grief. It is the world acknowledging that some losses are necessary without pretending that makes them smaller. The Dung Eater is among the most uncomfortable presences in Elden Ring's roster of characters, not because he is powerful or because his lore is particularly complex, but because what he represents sits in a place in the game's cosmology that is genuinely disturbing to contemplate. He is a Tarnished who has developed a philosophy built around desecration. He believes that by defiling the bodies of the dead in a specific ritual manner, he can spread a curse that prevents those souls from ever returning to the Erd Tree, that condemns them to a state outside the cycle, outside the managed return, permanently and irreversibly excluded. What makes this lore significant, beyond its surface unpleasantness, is the implication that it works. The curse he spreads, called the Seedbed Curse in the game's item descriptions, is real. The ritual desecration he performs has actual cosmological consequences, not metaphorical ones, not symbolic ones, but literal effects on the soul's relationship to the Erd Tree's cycle. This means that the Dung Eater has discovered or inherited knowledge of a method of interfering with the ring's law that does not require a demigod's power or access to the ring's runes directly. It requires only the performance of a specific act on a specific kind of body. The bureaucracy of cosmic law, it turns out, has exploitable edge cases. His questline involves the acquisition of seedbed curses, objects that represent the souls already marked by his ritual, and his desire to spread the curse as widely as possible. The philosophical underpinning of his project, to the extent that it is articulated, is a rejection of the Erd Tree's system of managed return. He does not want souls to be recycled. He wants them to be free of that process, even if the freedom he offers them is a freedom into formless, unguided darkness, rather than into anything that could be called peace. It is a radical, anti-Golden Order position expressed through the most transgressive means available to a single person acting alone. The relationship between the Dung Eater's lore and the larger cosmological debates in the game is not incidental. He is, in the most grotesque possible way, making an argument that Fia also makes, that the Three Fingers also make, that the Erd Tree's cycle is not an unambiguous good, that the management of souls is a form of control, that what has been called grace may also be called a cage. His method of making this argument is indefensible by any humane standard, but the argument itself, stripped of its manner of expression, is one the game takes seriously enough to give multiple other characters a version of. What the Dung Eater reveals, in the end, is that the most repellent philosophy in the game and the most idealistic one share a premise, that the way things currently work is wrong. They differ only in what they believe should replace it, and in the means they consider acceptable for bringing the replacement about. The Godskin apostles and nobles are among the more philosophically loaded enemy types in Elden Ring, and their lore is threaded through with references to a history that the game's surface narrative only partially illuminates. They are described as followers of a tradition that predates the Golden Order, practitioners of a form of power that involves the flaying and wearing of divine skin, which is not a metaphor. They wear the skins of gods. The practice is described in their associated item texts with a matter-of-fact grimness that suggests it is ancient and that it has its own internal logic, however disturbing that logic appears from outside. The tradition they follow is connected through the lore to the gloam-eyed queen, a figure who is referenced throughout the game but never directly encountered, who wielded destined death and whose order was destroyed by Marika and Godfrey before the events of the game's accessible history. The Godskin practitioners are, in some sense, the survivors or inheritors of that destroyed order, carrying forward a tradition that the Golden Order considered sufficiently threatening to require military suppression. Their persistence in the game's present, operating out of various sacred sites that they have converted to their use, suggests that the suppression was not complete. What their lore reveals about the nature of divine power in the lands between is worth considering. The fact that gods in this world have skins that can be worn, that divine power can be partially accessed through the physical substance of a divine body, says something about the nature of divinity in this cosmology. It is not purely metaphysical. It is in some sense physical. The power of a god is in some measure distributed through their body, and that body, if the right things are done to it, can be used by someone who was not born with access to that power. This is consistent with other aspects of the game's lore, the way great runes can be accessed through the physical remains of demigods, the way that Elden Ring itself took physical form within Marika's body. In the lands between, the division between the spiritual and the physical is more permeable than most cosmologies allow for. The giants, who appear in the mountaintop area of the game's later regions, carry a different kind of hidden lore, one connected to the Erd Tree's fire and to the history of who has been asked to carry burdens for which they received nothing in return. The fire giants were the keepers of the fell god's flame, a divine fire that predated the Erd Tree, that came from outside the Golden Order's sanctioned universe of meaning. Marika's campaign against the giants, carried out by Godfrey and his armies, was a campaign to extinguish that flame, to remove from the world a source of divine fire that was not under the Erd Tree's control. The last giant was not killed. He was cursed to tend the very flame he had been fighting to keep alive, to maintain it in chains rather than allowing it to go out entirely, perhaps because even Marika understood that some fires cannot be extinguished, only managed. The Mountain of Giants is, in this reading, one of the more quietly tragic places in the game. It is the site of a defeated people's last survivor, performing a function that serves the same power that destroyed his civilization, unable to die and unable to stop. The scale of it is overwhelming in a physical sense, the remnants of giant bodies embedded in the mountainside, the frozen expanse that suggests a world older and colder than the Erd Tree's golden warmth. And somewhere in all of that scale and cold, something is still burning, faithfully, because it was told to, and because stopping is no longer an option. There is a class of character in Elden Ring that is easy to overlook because they do not advance the main narrative and do not offer rewards that affect the game's system significantly. These are the characters who wait. They are found in small, sheltered locations, in churches, in ruins, in the protective shadows of broken walls. They have come to a point in their own stories where movement is no longer possible, and they remain where they are, maintaining whatever they are maintaining, until something changes or until it doesn't. Irina, who waits near the entrance to the Weeping Peninsula with a letter for her father, is one of these characters. She cannot travel. She is afraid of the road and of the creatures on it, and she has entrusted her letter to whoever passes by with the decency to carry it. Her father, Edgar, is a castle keeper in the south, holding a position of responsibility that has become increasingly difficult to justify as the world has deteriorated around it. The communication between them, which the player carries physically in the form of the letter, is a small and human thing in a world of cosmic stakes. A daughter trying to reach her father across a distance that has become dangerous, trusting a stranger with the only message she can send. Bach the seamster, who is found transformed into a demi-human and then gradually restored through the player's intervention, is another character of this type. Not powerful, not connected to the game's major lore threads, but present in the world with a specificity and a gentleness that makes him memorable in the way that small human things are memorable. He is a tailor who wants to alter the garments that the player finds, who has a particular kind of pride in his work that is touching because it is entirely out of proportion with the world's current state. The world is broken. The Golden Order is gone. Demigods are warring over fragments of a shattered law, and Bach wants to make sure your cape fits properly. There is something about that displacement between the enormity of what is happening and the smallness of what he is offering that the game handles with a care that it does not always get credit for. Millicent, whose quest line is connected to millennia and to the Scarlet Rot and to a question about whether a life defined entirely by the thing it carries is truly a life lived, is a character who moves rather than waits, who is in fact one of the most dynamic NPC presences in the game's world. But her lore connects her to the theme of waiting in a different way. She was made from millennia's own affliction, from the rot itself given a more individuated form, and the life she leads across the game's second half is a life spent trying to determine whether what she is can also be, at the same time, who she is, whether the thing she carries defines her completely, or whether there is something in her that exceeds it. This is a question the game does not answer for her. It leaves the answer in the space between her last scene and whatever the player understands it to mean. What these characters share is a quality of interiority that the game's world renders not through long dialogue or through detailed backstory, but through the smallness of their circumstances. They are people in a vast and broken world, trying to maintain whatever they can maintain, trying to stay connected to whatever they are connected to. The lore of the lands between is full of enormous forces and cosmic conflicts, of demigods and outer gods, and the machinery of existence breaking down and being rebuilt. But it is also full of Irina, waiting by the road with a letter, trusting that someone will carry it south. Both of these things are true of the same world. That the game holds them both without resolving the tension between them is one of its deepest and most generous qualities. As the night deepens and the lands between settles into its quietest register, there is one more layer of hidden lore worth uncovering, one that runs beneath all of the others, touching each of them without being identical to any. It is the layer of grace that exists not as a system of cosmic management, but as a simple quality of the world, the warmth that collects in certain places, not because it was directed there by the greater will, but because warmth, over long enough periods of time, accumulates in places where living things have gathered and remained. The sites of grace are the most obvious expression of this, but they are not the only one. It is present in the way certain spaces in the game feel genuinely safe, not mechanically safe, not logically safe, but atmospherically safe, as though the air in those places has been gentled by the accumulated presence of people who found rest there. The Church of LA has this quality. The first step grace, where most players begin, has it. These are not cosmologically significant locations. They are simply places where the world has been kind, where something has collected that functions like welcome, and where the person sitting in front of a screen in the dark of the real world might find for a moment that the virtual world and the actual world so share a quality they were not expecting. This is ultimately what the hidden lore of the lands between is in service of, not the accumulation of facts for their own sake, though the facts are genuinely interesting, not the construction of a complete picture of a world's history, though the picture, when enough pieces are placed together, becomes extraordinarily rich and coherent. It is in service of a quality of attention, the quality of a person who moves through something complex and layered and pays enough attention to feel the weight of it, to let the specific detail land with the force that specific details carry, to understand that every item description and every NPC gesture and every piece of environmental storytelling is an act of care performed by people who wanted the world they were making to be worth the time of anyone who chose to pay it attention. The world of Elden Ring repays that attention. It repays it in the way that large and serious things repay attention, not with answers, but with the kind of depth that makes the questions feel worth asking. Not with resolution, but with the kind of complexity that makes simplification feel like loss. And on nights like this one, it repays it with a particular kind of quietude, the quietude of a world that has survived enormous things and is, at this hour, simply resting, holding its history within itself, letting the golden light fall where it falls, letting the stars move, and now that the hand that held them still has finally been laid down. The item descriptions of the lands between contain, if you read enough of them in sequence, something that functions like a memoir, not of any single character, but of the world itself, written in the aggregate voice of everything that was made, and named and lost. A talisman found near a ruined altar carries a description that mentions a practitioner who has been forgotten by everyone except the talisman. A weapon carried by a knight whose name no one remembers describes the campaigns it witnessed in language that is neither proud nor regretful, simply present. These fragments, taken together, constitute a literature of a specific kind, a literature of the margin, of the thing that survived not because it was important, but because it was durable. The lands between smiths and craftspeople are almost entirely anonymous in its canonical history. The great figures, the demigods, the fingers, the Elden Lord, occupy the center of every account. But the shields were made by someone. The armor was fitted to someone's body by hands that understood the relationship between metal and movement. The talismans were inscribed by people with specific beliefs about what the inscriptions would do, beliefs that were precise enough to have made the talismans work for the purposes they were made for. The craftspeople of the lands between are present in their work and absent from the record, which is a form of invisibility that is also a form of permanence. The record has not survived. The work has. The grace that the tarnished receives is, in one reading, a form of recognition. The world's acknowledgement that this particular person is present and that their presence has been noticed by whatever notices such things to be graced is to be seen by something enormous. This can be comforting. It can also be the beginning of an enormous responsibility that nobody asked for. The tarnished did not choose to be called back. They did not fill out an application for the grace that returned to them and pointed them toward the Erd tree. They woke up on a beach with a direction and a purpose and no explanation, and the game asks you to take that condition seriously, to inhabit the experience of being called without being consulted, of being necessary without being asked. In the deepest quiet of the lands between, in the places where no enemies patrol and no music plays, and the only sound is the ambient texture of a world that has been breathing since before the Golden Order named the manner of its breathing, there is something available that is not available anywhere else in any of the world's louder spaces. It is the experience of simply being present in a place that has been present for a very long time, that will continue to be present after you have moved on, that holds its history not as a performance for the benefit of observers, but as the simple accumulation of everything that has happened within it. The lands between is not performing its depth for you. It is simply deep. You happen to be in it. For the duration of your attention, that is enough. The Erd tree's light, seen from a distance, has a quality that changes depending on the time of day the game simulates and the weather conditions and the angle of approach. There are moments when it looks like something burning very calmly, a fire that has found a way to sustain itself indefinitely by becoming something other than fire. There are moments when it looks golden in the most literal possible sense, the color of precious metal, of stored wealth, of something that was kept because it was valued. And there are moments, particularly at the edges of day and night, when it looks like neither of these things, when it looks simply like light, undecided about what it means, falling where it falls, warming whatever it touches without preference or intention. In those moments, the Erd tree is the most honest version of itself. It is not a theology or a political structure or a recycling mechanism for the dead. It is a very large tree that produces a great deal of light. Everything else is interpretation. The sleeping things in the lands between, Miquella in his cocoon, the dormant dragons in their ancient roosts, the giant deathbird that exists as a night presence over certain fields, the old spirits that accumulate at certain underground altars, are all waiting for something. Not necessarily the same thing, not necessarily consciously, but there is a quality in the game's sleeping and dormant figures that suggests the world has a relationship with waiting that is fundamental rather than incidental. The lands between has been waiting for a long time, for the tarnished, for the grace to return, for the ring to be remade, or remade differently, or not remade at all, but replaced by something that the world does not yet have language for. The waiting is not a condition of failure. It is a condition of readiness, the world holding itself in the particular state that a specific kind of future requires, patient and still and full of everything it has accumulated across the centuries of its waiting. There is a population in the lands between that moves through the ruins of the world with a quality of patience that is unlike anything the game's more powerful figures demonstrate. The nomadic merchants, who appear at intervals along the roadsides and in the corners of the world's various regions, carry their goods in enormous packs and sit in small circles of warmth that they have made for themselves in landscapes that are otherwise inhospitable. They sell useful things, arrows and smithing materials and basic equipment, and they speak in a manner that is pleasant but measured, as though they have long since learned to give only what is asked for and nothing more. What the game's item lore reveals about the nomadic merchants is not widely discussed, and it is one of the more affecting hidden truths in the lands between's broader social history. The nomadic merchants were once a unified people who traveled together in a large community, a caravan culture with its own traditions and its own understanding of the world they moved through. They sang together. There is a specific item in the game, the nomadic merchant's bell bearing, that when read reveals that the merchants were broken apart from each other by some past event, scattered across the lands between individually, and that the song they once sang together is now sung alone, each merchant humming pieces of the same melody in isolation across vast distances. This is a detail that requires almost nothing from the player in order to register. There is no questline attached to it, no reward for understanding it, no character who explains it further. It simply exists in the item description, in the specific sorrow of a sentence that describes communal singing that has become solitary singing across the width of an entire broken world. The merchants do not ask you to mourn what they have lost. They sit in their small warmth and sell their goods and continue to hum. But the information is there, waiting in the description of the bell bearing that appears in your inventory if you choose to read it, a small and complete portrait of a loss that has no place in the game's central narrative, but that is, in its smallness, entirely true. The distribution of the merchants across the lands between is itself a kind of map of a former wholeness. They are in Limgrave and in Liurnia and in the Altus Plateau and in Caelid and in the far underground spaces. They are in every region. What was once a community moving together has become a community of individuals placed at the far edges of each other's reach, each one a remnant of a collective that no longer exists as a collective. They continue the practices of the community in individual form, the warmth, the trade, the humming, but the practices are changed by the loss of the community that gave them their original meaning. A song sung by one person is a different thing from the same song sung by many. The melody may be identical, the act is entirely different. There is something in the nomadic merchant's situation that resonates beyond the world of the lands between, something that the game did not need to include, but did, and that inclusion is one of the small indicators of the depth of care that went into making this world. The question of what happens to communal practices when the community that sustained them is broken apart, when the song outlives the singer's proximity to each other, is not a question specific to a fantasy world. It is a question that real communities have faced in real history, and that individuals face in the smaller scale of their own lives when the people who shared particular things with them are gone or distant. The merchants carry that question in their item lore with a simplicity that does not try to universalize it. They simply tell you what happened to them. The resonance is yours to find. Godfrey, the first Elden Lord, is one of the most important figures in the Lands Between's history, and also one of the most psychologically complex, which is not a quality that his physical presentation immediately suggests. He is enormous, golden-haired, war-shaped in every aspect of his bearing. He holds an enormous axe. His first appearance in the game's memory sequence presents him as a figure of pure martial authority, a general's general, a man whose relationship with the world is organized primarily around the question of what he is fighting and how. What is hidden in Godfrey's lore is the more nuanced story of what he was before he became the first Elden Lord, and what he became after he was exiled. He was, before Marika chose him, a warrior named Huara Lu, a chieftain from a people called the Badlands, a figure who had earned his position through combat and through the specific quality of leadership that combat cultures recognize. He carried with him, in the earliest phase of his life, a beast called Sarosh, who is visible as the creature on his back in the game's encounter. Sarosh was not a decoration or a symbol. He was a living presence, a spirit of ferocity that Godfrey had tamed, or rather, that had agreed to serve as a restraint on Godfrey's own nature, a leash that Godfrey wore voluntarily because the force within him, without restraint, was more than he or anyone around him could manage. This is a specific and unusual detail. Godfrey, the figure who would become the first Elden Lord, the military commander of the Lands Between's unification, was himself restrained by a choice he made about his own nature. He was not powerful despite understanding his own destructive capacity. He was powerful in the specific way that comes from understanding what you are capable of and choosing to bind it with something living, something that would push back if the binding were needed. Sarosh is not a trophy. He is a collaboration, an agreement between Godfrey and a spirits of ferocity that said, in effect, we can both exist here, but only if I am present to keep what you are from going further than it should. When Marika exiled Godfrey, stripping him of his grace and sending him and his warriors out of the Lands Between, she did something that the game's lore describes with a specific detail. She made him the first of the Tarnished. He was not merely exiled. He was the originating instance of the category that the player character belongs to. Every Tarnished who exists in the game's present moment exists within a lineage that begins with Godfrey's exile, The tarnished are not a random population of people who happen to lose grace. They are the descendants and inheritors of a specific event, the exile of the first Elden Lord and his army, sent out of the world they had built and told to wander until grace found them again. Why Marika exiled him has several possible readings in the lore. The most commonly cited is that Godfrey had exhausted his wars, that there was nothing left for him to fight, and that a warrior without war is not able to grow in the way that the greater will apparently requires of those who serve its purposes. But there is another reading, one that sits beside the first without contradicting it, that Marika needed to be free of the obligation that Godfrey represented, free to take Radagon as her new consort, and to pursue whatever the next phase of the Golden Order required. Godfrey was exiled because the world had moved past what he was needed for. This is not a gentle thing to do to a person who built the world you are now finished needing him to maintain. His return in the game's endgame is framed as the answer to a summoning. The grace that sent him away has called him back, and he arrives not as the Golden Order adorned first Elden Lord, but as Huara Lu in his original identity, stripped of everything that the title gave him, fighting with the ferocity that Sarash spent so many years restraining. He releases that restraint explicitly. He removes Sarash. He becomes the thing he always was beneath the role, and in that becoming there is both a liberation and a loss. A man who spent his life shaped by a function, discovering what he is when the function is no longer required of him. What that man is turns out to be enormous and fierce and honest in a way that his tenure as Elden Lord may not have allowed him to be. His final form is more him than his official history. That is either a tragedy or a kind of gift. The game allows it to be both. The dragons of the lands between are ancient, older than the Golden Order, older than the Erd Tree in any meaningful historical sense, present in the worlds at the time of the Crucible and carrying forward into the present a connection to the world's pre-Golden Order state that no other creature type fully shares. They are not merely large animals. They are, according to the game's lore, beings with a specific and documented relationship to the lands between's history, participants in events that shaped the world before the current era, and survivors of those events, in forms that carry the marks of what they experienced. The Elden Dragon Grail, the enormous and dormant creature that lies in Caelid, surrounded by smaller dragons, is described in item lore as the mother of all dragons. Her scale is overwhelming even by the standards of a game that regularly presents the player with enormously scaled beings. She does not fight. She endures, surrounded by her children, in a landscape already being consumed by the scarlet rot. She is old in a way that is different from the aged humans and demigods of the game's present. Hers is the oldness of something that has been present since a fundamentally different era that watched the world change around it across time spans that make the Golden Order's history look brief. The ancient dragon lore connected to the Erd Tree reveals a covenant that was struck between dragons and the Erd Tree's power at some point in the world's history. A covenant in which the dragons agreed to something, gave up something, and received something in exchange. The Gravelstone dragon abilities in the game's spell system are connected to lightning, which is described as the ancient power of the dragons, distinct from the Erd Tree's flame magic. The split between these two forms of power, lightning and fire, maps onto a division between what was present before the Golden Order and what the Golden Order brought. Dragons represent the older power. The Erd Tree represents the newer one. The covenant between them represents a negotiated coexistence between two cosmological forces that might otherwise have been in more direct conflict. Placidusax, who sleeps in a curled and timeless position at the center of an impossible crumbling space at the base of the game's highest elevation, carries a title that speaks directly to the nature of his loss. He was Elden Lord in the age before the Elden Ring, as it currently exists, in the service of a god who subsequently abandoned the lands between. He was left behind. His god departed. For what reason, toward what destination, the lore does not say, and Placidusax remained waiting, in a space outside ordinary time, for a return that has never come. He is described as still awaiting the return of his god. He has been waiting in that curled position, in that collapsed time-space, for an indeterminate period that the game's design implies has been very long. This is a detail about loyalty that is almost unbearably poignant if you allow yourself to sit with it. Placidusax was not defeated. He was not exiled or shattered or corrupted. He made a choice to wait, a choice whose difficulty is measured by the scale of the waiting that choice has required. Whatever he was, whatever his relationship to his departed god was, it was sufficient to keep him in that position through whatever length of time the transition from his era to the present one represents. He is still waiting when the Tarnished arrives. He is still, in the most fundamental sense of the word, faithful to something that has given him no sign that his faithfulness is known or appreciated. The encounter with Placidusax is, in the context of that lore, not a battle against an enemy. It is an interruption of a vigil. The lesser dragons who populate Caelid and the mountaintops and the volcanic regions each carry traces of the larger dragon history in their item drops and in their behaviors. They are not mere wildlife. They are the diminished inheritors of a tradition that was once cosmologically significant, now reduced by the passage of time and the rot's spread and the general diminishment that the shattering caused to everything that was not directly serving a demigod's immediate agenda. They carry lightning in the old way. They breathe fire in combinations that speak to old powers not entirely lost. They persist in the world's broken present as reminders that the lands between was shaped by forces that predate the Golden Order, and that will, in whatever form survives, post-date it as well. The Carian royal family, which governed Liurnia of the Lakes from the Academy and from the royal study before the shattering, represents one of the most internally coherent lore traditions in the game. Their magic is lunar, cold, silver, oriented toward the celestial rather than the terrestrial, drawing on forces that the Golden Order acknowledges only awkwardly, and that the Carians themselves understand as belonging to a tradition that exists independently of anything Marika established. The Carian lineage is a lineage of scholars and sorcerers, of people who looked at the sky with the particular attention that yields knowledge rather than worship. The moon is not merely a symbol in the Carian tradition. It is, according to item lore connected to the Academy and to Renala's spells, a genuine source of magical influence, a celestial body with properties that can be studied and understood and eventually accessed the way one might access any resource through sustained attention and appropriate methodology. The sorceries associated with the moon are not prayers. They are the results of inquiry. They represent a relationship with cosmic forces that is fundamentally empirical rather than devotional, an approach to the world's deep structures that is distinct from both the Golden Order's faith and the underground culture's ancestral rites. Renala's full moon spell is, in this context, not merely a powerful attack. It is a statement of mastery, the end point of a tradition of lunar study that Renala represents at its highest level, the result of a lifetime of attention to the moon's properties and cycles and the specific ways in which its influence enters the lands between's magical substrate. She did not arrive at her power through divine favor or through the grace of a higher power. She arrived at it through scholarship, which is a different kind of achievement and a different kind of relationship with power. one that belongs to the person who did the work rather than to the force that granted the gift. Rani's connection to the lunar tradition is both inheritance and departure. She inherits from Renala a tradition of lunar magic and an orientation toward the sky rather than toward the Erd tree. But her relationship with the dark moon is something different from Renala's relationship with the full moon. Darker, stranger, more directly connected to the space between things, rather than to any single celestial body's light. The dark moon is the moon when it is not illuminated, when it is present in the sky, only as an absence, a darkness against a darker darkness, visible only by what it blocks. Rani's magic is not the magic of the moon's light. It is the magic of the moon's hidden face, of the part that is always turned away. The glintstone sorceries, which the Academy systematized and taught, draw on the crystalline material found in fallen stars, a connection to the larger cosmological history of the lands between, in which the sky and the earth have been in a relationship of exchange since long before the Golden Order named what that exchange meant. Glintstones are, according to the game's lore, the remnants of stars that fell, pieces of the sky's substance now embedded in the earth, carrying within their mineral structure some trace of the cosmic energy they held before they fell. To use glintstone in sorcery is to use the sky's own material as a medium, to access through crystal what was once carried through light. The Academy understood this. It is why their tower reaches upward. The Lucarian sorceries are among the most precisely documented magical traditions in the game's lore, and what they document alongside their specific effects is a particular kind of intellectual culture, one that maintains records, that values transmission across generations, that builds knowledge cumulatively rather than treating each practitioner as a solitary genius reinventing their art from scratch. The Academy's students are not self-taught eccentrics. They are participants in a tradition, and the items associated with them carry the record of that tradition's development in their descriptions. This is, in itself, a lore detail, the fact that knowledge in the lands between can be institutional as well as individual, that some of what the world knows has been carefully maintained rather than simply discovered and then lost. Volcano Manor is one of the more atmospherically distinctive locations in Elden Ring, and its lore is as strange as its setting warrants. It is a manor built inside a volcano, not at the volcano's foot, not in its shadow, but inside it, at the edge of the magma that fills the mountain's interior. The people who live there have chosen to make their home in a place that is, by every ordinary standard, extraordinarily dangerous. And that choice speaks to something about their relationship with danger and with the world's ordinary standards. The inhabitants of the manor are, loosely, a collection of beings who have rejected the Golden Order's authority, who have chosen, in one form or another, to exist outside the system that the Ring's law established. Rykard, who rules the manor as its patron, is a demigod who made a choice so extreme that it stands as one of the most transgressive acts in a game populated with transgressive acts. He allowed himself to be consumed by the god-devouring serpent, deliberately merging his consciousness with an ancient creature that predates the Golden Order's arrival, becoming something that is neither demigod nor serpent, but a specific and disturbing fusion of both. His stated goal was to achieve immortality through this fusion. Whether it worked depends on how you define the things it was supposed to accomplish. The god-devouring serpent is an important figure in the game's pre-Golden Order history. It is described as something that the Golden Order has been attempting to suppress for the entirety of its existence, an entity that represents a principle of consumption so fundamental that it cannot be incorporated into the Order's system of managed life and death. It simply eats. It eats gods. It eats the divine substance that the Golden Order is built around protecting and distributing carefully. From the Order's perspective, the serpent is a threat to the entire architecture of the world's sacred economy. From the serpent's perspective, if a serpent can be said to have a perspective, the divine is simply food. Rykard's merger with this creature is, in the lore's terms, an act of profound philosophical commitment. He did not simply gain the serpent's power. He became the serpent, or became something that contains both himself and the serpent in a single body, with two agendas that are not entirely compatible. The Rykard who speaks in the game's encounter is clearly still present, articulate, sardonic, aware of his own history and of the irony of his position. But the body he inhabits is the serpent's body, and the serpent's appetites are its body's appetites, and the relationship between Rykard's conscious goals and the serpent's fundamental drive is one of the more unsettling ambiguities in a game that is comfortable with ambiguity. The questline associated with the manor in which the player is recruited to assassinate other Tarnished speaks to the manor's larger project, the systematic killing of Tarnished who are working toward the restoration of the Elden Ring. Rykard does not want the ring restored. He does not want the Golden Order's law reinstated. His rejection of that system is total, and the manor is his instrument of interference, a place where beings who share his rejection gather, where the project of undoing the order is pursued through means that are clearly violent, but that are, in the manor's own internal moral universe, justifiable as resistance. The presence of Tanith, who serves as Rykard's devoted representative within the manor, adds a human dimension to the lore that is easy to underestimate. She is not a demigod. She is not a being of supernatural power. She is a person who has given her loyalty to Rykard in terms that the game suggests go beyond political allegiance into something more personal. Her grief at Rykard's death is genuine and strange. Strange not because grief itself is unusual, but because of what she does with it, which is a detail that the game presents in its environmental storytelling with the quiet horror of something observed rather than explained. She does not ask for your understanding. She simply continues, in whatever form continuing takes for her after the loss of the thing she devoted herself to. Her story ends in a way that raises questions the game does not answer, and those unanswered questions are part of what makes her one of the more lingering presences in the game's roster of secondary characters. There is a creature in the lands between that exists in a state of such apparent simplicity that most players do not spend long contemplating it. The jellyfish, glowing, translucent, drifting through the air of certain regions of the world with a quality of aimless, gentle motion that is entirely at odds with the violence that characterizes most of the lands between's fauna, carry in their associated item lore a connection to the world's dead that is genuinely moving once it becomes clear. The jellyfish are, according to the lore connected to their drops and to the questline of Roderica, the spirits of people who died and were unable to return to the Erd Tree in the conventional manner. They are the dead who drifted, who did not find their way back, who persist in the form of these luminous and directionless creatures, because the cycle that should have processed them has been broken. They are not hostile, they are not tormented, they are simply present, drifting, carrying within their soft forms some remnant of the people they once were, in a state that is neither rest nor continuation, but something between them that has no name in the Golden Order's theology because the Golden Order did not design this outcome and did not prepare a category for it. Roderica's connection to these spirits, her ability to perceive them, her desire to help them, and eventually her development into a spirit tuner who can communicate with the dead and strengthen their ability to manifest, is a questline that is easy to miss and that rewards attention in ways that go beyond its mechanical benefits. She begins as a person who has lost everyone she came to the lands between with, whose companions all became the jellyfish spirits she can see drifting around her. Her response to this loss is not bitterness. It is a turned attention toward the spirits themselves, toward the question of what can be done for them, toward the development of an ability that allows her to serve as a bridge between the living and this particular form of the dead. The spirit calling bell and the ashes that the player uses throughout the game are, in the context of the jellyfish lore, not merely mechanical tools for summoning combat assistance. They are, within the world's own internal logic, the means by which the dead are given a form of purpose, a temporary manifestation in the living world, a moment of usefulness after a death that the cycle should have concluded, but that the shattering left unfinished. The ashes contain something of the person who once existed. When they are summoned, that something is present again, briefly, in a form that can act. Roderika's ability to strengthen these manifestations is an ability to make more possible for beings who, in the absence of the cycle's proper function, have nowhere else to go. The fact that the most quietly hopeful questline in Elden Ring involves a person developing the ability to help the dead that the world's machinery has abandoned is not a coincidence. It is a design choice that speaks to something the game believes about what remains possible even in the deepest brokenness. Not cosmic restoration, not the repair of every system, but the small, specific, careful attention of one person toward the beings that the large systems have left behind. Roderika is not trying to fix the Erd Tree. She is trying to help the particular spirits drifting around her find something useful to do with what they have left. This is a different kind of hope than the hope associated with becoming Elden Lord. It is smaller. It is more certain of succeeding. The paintings found throughout the lands between are not merely decorative objects. They are, in the game's internal logic, functional, each one a created space, a world within the world, made by a painter with the specific intention of providing somewhere for a particular kind of being to exist without the pressures that the surface world would otherwise apply to them. The painted worlds are sanctuaries. Their interiors are real, which is to say physically accessible, traversable spaces that were brought into existence through the act of skilled artistic creation. They are among the most extraordinary things in the lands between's history, and they are the product of a tradition of painting that the game's item lore treats with the gravity it deserves. Haligtree's painted world is the destination of a quest line that unfolds slowly across the game's second half, and its lore is connected to the figure of Miquella in ways that, when fully understood, add a further dimension to his larger project. The painted world was made as a place of rest, a quiet space removed from the conflicts of the surface world, where beings who needed somewhere gentle could go. The painter who made it, a child with a specific ability for creating worlds through the medium of paint, was connected to the tradition of the Snow Witch and to the older magical lineages as that Ranni also draws from. The act of painting a world is, in the lands between's cosmology, an act that does not merely represent a place, but makes it a creative act of such specificity and intentionality that it produces something real from something imagined. The quest line associated with the painted world involves bringing warmth to a cold place, a small quest, in the game's mechanical terms, with no great reward attached to its completion. But the resonance of the act, in the context of the game's larger preoccupations, is considerable. Warmth and cold are not merely temperatures in the lands between. Warmth is associated with life, with the Erd Tree's grace, with the presence of something that is attending to the world, with benevolence. Cold is associated with the lunar tradition, with the absence of that specific kind of warmth, with a different kind of existence that is not hostile to life, but is organized around different principles. To bring warmth to a painted world, made in the cold tradition, is to perform a small synthesis, not the resolution of a cosmic conflict, but the introduction of a quality into a space that had previously been defined by its absence. The figure who waits in that painted world for the warmth to arrive is one of the quietest presences in the game's roster of memorable characters. She has been there for a very long time. She has been doing the work she knows how to do in the space she was given, without urgency and without complaint. She is, in her own way, a portrait of what it is to maintain something carefully in the absence of any guarantee that the maintenance will be acknowledged or that the waiting will end. She waits for warmth. She works in its absence. She receives it when it comes, with a simplicity that suggests she has not allowed herself to expect it. This is a character note that the game delivers in a very few exchanges, and it has the weight of something true. Throughout the lands between, there are figures who carry power that is not originally theirs, who wield it either by agreement, by theft, or by some process of transmission that the original holder may or may not have sanctioned. The Great Runes are the most obvious instance of this. Each demigod carries a fragment of the Elden Ring's law, not because they were born with it, but because it scattered to them. It came to them in the shattering, and they claimed it, and their claim has given them an authority that the ring's original structure did not intend to distribute in this way. What the game's lore explores, through the demigod's various situations, is the question of what borrowed power does to the person who holds it. Morgott holds his shard, but refuses to use it in the way it was designed to be used. He will not sit upon the Elden Throne, will not claim the position that his possession of the Great Rune technically qualifies him for. His refusal is not weakness. It is a moral position, an understanding that the power he holds was not meant for someone marked as he is marked. A refusal to claim something that the world he loves would consider stolen rather than earned. He holds the power and maintains the capital and serves the system that has rejected him, and he does all of this without the compensation of using what he carries. This is the most extreme form of held restraint in the game, and it is what makes Morgott's story so lastingly affecting. Godric's use of his Great Rune, by contrast, is the story of someone who has the borrowed power and cannot make it feel like enough. He grafts, he adds, he takes the limbs of others and attaches them to his own body as though accumulation of physical presence can substitute for the depth of power he lacks. His Great Rune is real, and his authority to hold it is technically legitimate, and none of that is sufficient to make him feel secure in what he has. He is a figure of insecurity made enormous, someone who has been given more than enough, and for whom more than enough is never sufficient, because the problem he is trying to solve with accumulation is not a problem of quantity. Radahun's use of his Great Rune, which governs the stars, is connected to the gravity magic he learned and to the astronomical work he undertook in service of whatever the stars' movement would have caused. He is, of the demigods, the one whose use of his borrowed power is most oriented outward, not toward personal gain or personal security, but toward the management of something larger than himself. His madness, which the rot produced in him, yet does not eliminate the power he holds, but it eliminates his ability to use it intentionally. The stars he held in place were held by a will that the rot eventually consumed. What he was maintaining through the exercise of his power becomes in his madness something he can no longer maintain, even though the power is still present. The power outlasts the intention that made it coherent. What this pattern reveals, across the various demigods, is something that the game seems to believe about power in general, that power without a coherent relationship to its own purpose is unstable. It does not simply exist neutrally. It does something to the person who holds it, to the world around that person, to the possibilities that its presence opens and forecloses. The Great Runes are not inert objects. They are active shaping forces, and they shape the people who carry them as much as they shape as to anything else. The demigods are not merely people who happen to have power. They are people who have been changed by carrying power that was designed for a purpose they did not inherit, along with the power itself. They have the instrument. They do not have the instruction manual. And the result of using an instrument without fully understanding its design is visible across the lands between in every domain that bears a demigod's mark. There are sites of grace in the lands between that exist in places that do not obviously warrant them, in the middle of fields that carry no particular strategic significance, at the base of cliffs that lead nowhere important, beside bodies of water that are not connected to any quest line or significant location. These sites exist in the game's design for practical reasons. They allow rest and recovery in regions where the player needs them. But within the game's lore, they carry a different implication. Sites of grace collect where the world's accumulated sanctity has gathered, according to the internal logic of how grace works in the lands between. This means that the sites which appear to exist in the middle of nowhere are, in fact, markers of something that happened there, something that accumulated enough of the world's regard or significance or simple passage of people and events to cause grace to pool. A site of grace in a quiet field is the evidence of something that was significant there once, something that no longer has a visible marker, but that left enough of a trace in the world's fabric for the grace to settle. This reading of the sites of grace turns the entire landscape of the lands between into a form of historical record. Every site is a location where meaning was concentrated enough to leave a permanent mark. The roads between sites are connections between meaning nodes, routes that were traveled often enough by people doing things that mattered to them that the grace followed the traveling. The areas where sites of grace are absent are areas where nothing significant enough has happened, or where the shattering's damage has disrupted the flow of grace in ways that prevent it from settling. The map of sites is, in this reading, a map of the world's accumulated value, of where it has been most fully itself. The particular quality of rest that occurs at a site of grace in the game, the way time seems to organize itself differently, the way the ambient sense of threat withdraws to its edges, is the experiential correlate of this historical concentration. To rest at a site of grace is to rest in a place where the world has been most thoroughly itself, where whatever value the world holds has most fully accumulated. It is not merely a mechanical safe zone. It is a place where the world is most legible, where whatever it is trying to say about itself has gathered enough density to be perceptible. The warmth is not added, it has collected. Over how long and from how many moments of significance, the sites do not say. But their presence is itself the record. The Marika's scars, which appear in certain sites of grace, and which Melina uses to communicate with the player character, are themselves a form of preserved memory. The traces of Marika's own passage through those sites marks that she left not deliberately, but as a consequence of carrying within herself the law of the world through which she passed. Where Marika rested, something of her remained. Where the queen of the lands between sat down beside a fire, the nature of her presence impressed itself into the place in a way that survived everything that has happened since. These are not sacred inscriptions. They are simply the marks of someone whose nature was so thoroughly interwoven with the world's own laws that she could not pass through it without leaving a record. Stormvale Castle was not always what the game's present shows. It was, in the history of the lands between before the shattering, a structure of genuine authority, a seat of Godric's family's power, positioned at the gateway between the coastal lowlands and the more protected interior regions, guarding a passage that was important enough to warrant the investment of stone and garrison and the full apparatus of feudal military architecture. It was built to last. It was built to be approached and to make an impression on that approach. The ascending path, the scale of the walls, the visible intention of a structure designed to be seen from a distance, and to communicate something about the power it protected. What Stormveil communicates in the game's present is something more complicated than simple power. It communicates the persistence of form after the content has changed. The castle still stands. The passages still exist. The battlements are still manned after a fashion. But the authority it was built to serve has fragmented into something that the castle's architecture was not designed to accommodate. Godric, the weakest of the Shardbearers, the most insecure, the most given to accumulation as a substitute for depth, is not the lord the castle was built for. He is the inheritor of a structure that was made for something grander than he has been able to become, and the gap between the castle's architecture and the quality of its current inhabitant is one of the first specific instances of the larger gap that characterizes the lands between, in general, the gap between what things were made to hold and what they are currently holding. The grafted dead who populate its lower depths are the most viscerally disturbing version of Godric's project. Human remains arranged into configurations that are not human, assembled from multiple bodies into single massive forms, the raw material of Godric's ambition in its most literal expression. These are not monsters in the traditional sense. They are something sadder, the result of a lord who looked at the resources available to him, the bodies of people who died in and around his castle, and saw not individuals to be mourned and returned to the Erd tree's cycle but material to be repurposed. The grafted scion that serves as the game's opening encounter is, in the context of the castle's full lore, a preview of this logic at a scale small enough to approach before the logic is fully understood. The connection between Stormveil's design and the lands between's geography tells a further story. The castle sits at a specific choke point, controlling access between regions in a way that suggests its original architects understood the land structure and built the castle to take advantage of it. There was a sophistication to the original construction that survives even in the castle's current ruinous and modified state, in the placement of walls, in the use of the land's natural elevation, in the defensive logic of the approach. Someone built this with genuine knowledge of what a fortification needs to be to do its job. That knowledge is present in the stones regardless of what they have been used for since. The craft outlives the purpose that commissioned it, which is a truth the lands between repeats across many of its constructed spaces, each one carrying in its own material the intelligence of whoever made it, intact and available even when the intention that directed that intelligence is gone. Among the more cosmologically significant creatures in the lands between, and among the most dangerous in a purely physical sense, the rune bears carry in their altered forms a direct indication of what happens to living things in the immediate vicinity of a great rune's unmanaged power. They are bears, large, powerful, not remarkable in any supernatural sense in their original form, who have been exposed to the concentrated energy of the Elden Ring's fragments and transformed by that exposure into something that is still recognizably a bear, but that has become so saturated with runic power that their bodies have begun to exceed the tolerances of what bear bodies are designed to be. They are not hostile because they were corrupted in any moral sense. They are hostile because the power they carry is too large for them, because they are in a constant state of physical stress produced by containing something that was not designed to be contained in a body of their dimensions, because existing has become a condition of ongoing pain that nothing they do can address. The rune bears are the most visible instance of a phenomenon that the game's lore treats with consistency. The tendency of the Elden Ring's power, when unmanaged and concentrated, to transform the things it touches beyond their capacity to integrate the transformation. This phenomenon explains much about the lands between's ecology in the aftermath of the shattering. The great runes scattered. Their power was not neutralized. It continued to radiate outward from wherever the demigods held the fragments, affecting the landscapes of their domains in ways that ranged from subtle to severe. The animals, the plants, the people who lived within those domains absorbed, at varying degrees of proximity, varying amounts of that radiating power, and the results are visible across the game's landscape in the specific nature of each domain's fauna. Kylid's creatures are rot-touched. Liurnia's are sorcery-touched, bearing traces of the Academy's long, magical saturation of the region. The mountaintops carry the cold influence of Rykard's magma and the ancient frost of the Giants' era simultaneously. Each region's wildlife is, in this reading, a record of the specific magical pressures that region has been under. The ghost fires that burn throughout the lands between, the pale flames that float above the ground in regions associated with significant death and disruption, are connected in the lore to the uncollected dead, to the spirits who could not be returned to the Erd Tree in the aftermath of the shattering. They are not dangerous, these fires. They do not burn. They simply exist, hovering, marking the places where the world's collection system failed and where what should have been returned remains, in the form of light, present but unheld. They are the most ambient version of the same phenomenon that the jellyfish spirits represent. The dead who persist, not because they chose to, but because the machine that should have processed their passing is broken. To move through a field of ghost fires at night, in the lands between, is to move through a space defined by accumulated loss, by the specific weight of all the deaths that occurred here and were not resolved in the way deaths are supposed to be resolved within the Golden Order's structure. It is not frightening in any simple sense. It is elegiac. The lights are the right kind of lights for what they are. Pale, soft, the color of something that has been burning for a long time on very little fuel, the color of persistence without sustenance. They will continue to burn, presumably, until the cycle is restored and the dead they represent are finally returned to wherever they were always supposed to go. Or they will simply continue to burn, as some things do, long past the point at which what sustained them is available to be found. Time in the lands between does not move the way time moves in a world without magic and without the particular cosmological pressures that the game's lore describes. The presence of the Rune of Death removed from the ring's active structure means that the normal relationship between biological processes and the passage of time has been disrupted for those who live under the Golden Order's jurisdiction. The Erd Tree's management of the death cycle effectively slowed down the normal rate at which living things are used up by their own existence, or rather, it created a situation in which the used-up state could be reversed, in which the cycle of a life could be extended beyond its natural endpoint by the simple process of returning what had ended to something resembling its prior state. This has implications for how time is experienced in the lands between by beings of different kinds. The immortal demigods, Marika, Radagon, the Empyreans, do not experience time the way mortals do, because time for mortals is measured primarily by the approach of death, by the sense of a limited duration that gives each moment a specific weight that it would not otherwise have. For beings who cannot die in any conventional sense, time is something different, not the slow approach of an ending, but an indefinite continuation that has its own kind of pressure, the pressure of continuing to be without the organizing principle of a finite endpoint. The tarnished experience a version of this. They cannot die permanently. Each death returns them to the last site of grace, to begin again from a point that is not precisely where they left off, but that is close enough. What does this do to their experience of the world? The game does not address this directly in its narrative, but it is not a question that the lore forecloses. The implication of a being who dies repeatedly and returns each time is a being who has a different relationship with risk than a being for whom each decision might be the last. The tarnished can afford to be reckless in ways that mortals cannot. This affords them access to places and situations that a being with a finite number of attempts would never risk. But it also means that each of those attempts carries less weight than it otherwise would, that the experience of death and return, repeated often enough, might produce a relationship with the world's dangers that is more like practice than like encounter. The places in the lands between where time has been most distorted are its most extreme spaces. The Farum Azula, which is a floating city in a permanent state of temporal dissolution, where past and present and future appear to exist in a kind of overlapping simultaneity, and the area surrounding Placidusax, where ordinary time seems not merely slowed, but genuinely absent, where the act of approaching the sleeping dragon is an act of moving into a space that has removed itself from the normal flow of causation. These places are not merely interesting. They are evidence of what the world's cosmological pressures can do to time when those pressures reach sufficient intensity, that time, in the lands between, is not a fixed and universal property, but a local condition, variable and susceptible to the same forces of magical and cosmic interference that affect everything else. The ruins that fill the lands between are themselves a temporal phenomenon, records of a present moment that became a past moment and was preserved in stone, accessible now as evidence of what was. To look at a ruin is to be in two times simultaneously, the present moment of the looking and the past moment that the ruin records. The lands between is full of this doubled temporality, the sense of the past being not merely remembered, but physically present, accessible to direct observation, not merely reconstructed through inference, but actually there, the same stones, in the same arrangement, carrying the same evidence of what they were made for, weathered but not gone. The world is old enough that its past is everywhere, and there is a quality to being surrounded by that much visible history, that much physical evidence of times that have already been, and that continue to be present despite having ended, that is, at this particular hour, conducive to the kind of rest that comes when the mind has been gently occupied with something larger than itself for long enough to have released its grip on what it was holding. The night in the lands between is a different country than the day, not merely darker, not merely quieter, genuinely different in what it contains and what it allows. Certain creatures emerge only in the dark, carrying fire or frost or the pale light of the uncollected dead. Certain sounds become audible that the day's ambient density covers, the distant call of something large moving through the hills of Altus, the low resonance of wind through the Stormvale battlements, the particular silence of the underground regions that deepens further still when no enemy is nearby, and the only sound is the vast geological quiet of stone that has been still for longer than any human architecture. The night also reveals things about the light. The Erd tree at night is visible from every region, the same as always, but the darkness around it makes its light more specific, more concentrated, more clearly originating from a particular place rather than filling the sky generally. At night, the Erd tree is a lantern rather than a sun. Its light has a direction. You can orient by it, and people in the lands between presumably have, for as long as there have been people traveling in the dark and looking for a fixed point to navigate by. Before there were roads, there was the Erd tree. Before there were maps, there was the Erd tree. The light that makes the Golden Order's politics and the Ring's laws so complicated is, at its most basic level, simply a light, a thing to find your direction by when everything else is dark. The night creatures of the lands between, the deathbirds, the Miranda flowers whose spores drift more freely in the cool dark, the night cavalry that patrol roads that are safe in daylight, are not merely more dangerous versions of day creatures. They are specific presences, each connected through its lore to the aspects of the world's history that are most active in the dark. The deathbirds carry nascent butterfly wings and are associated with the spread of death in spaces where the cycle's management has failed. They are most present at night because the night is the time when the dead are closest to the surface of the world's attention, when the structures of the Golden Order's management, already weakened by the shattering, are most susceptible to the influence of what they were designed to contain. The Night of Night, the Black Knife Trackers, the various assassin figures that operate in the lands between's dark spaces, those too are creatures of the night in a specific sense. They are beings whose work requires concealment, whose purposes are best served by the confusion and reduced visibility that darkness provides. The Black Knife assassins who carried out the assassination that began everything moved in darkness. The Tarnished, who follow quest lines through the game's most hidden spaces, often do so at locations where darkness is the setting's dominant quality. The world's secrets, as a consistent rule, live in its darker places, in the spaces where the Erdtree's gold does not fully reach, where a different kind of attention is needed to see clearly. Thanks for watching. If these stories helped you relax, there's another video waiting on the left of your screen. You can let it play as you close your eyes. You might hear something soothing before you fall asleep again.